Hey there. I am so glad you made it back tonight. Wherever you are right now, curled up under a blanket propped against a stack of pillows, or maybe already halfway to sleep with your phone resting on your chest, welcome. Get yourself comfortable because tonight we are travelling somewhere most people never think to look. Somewhere so old, so quiet that history almost forgot to write it down. Long before the first king ever wore a crown. Long before the first temple was ever built, and more than 4,000 years before a single human being ever planted a seed on purpose, someone somewhere in a quiet corner of the desert was already kneeling beside a small fire-shaping dough with bare hands. And when scientists finally uncovered the proof of what that person made, it quietly rewrote everything we thought we knew about where our oldest comfort food truly began. But before we step into tonight's story, let me ask you for something small. If evenings like this one, slow, honest and full of real history, feel like a warm blanket for your mind, then take just a moment to like this video and subscribe, so more of these nights can find their way to you. And if you have a second, leave a comment down below. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, and what time it is where you are right now. I love reading those little details before I close my own eyes. Now go ahead and turn the lights down low. If you have a fan nearby or anything that hums softly in the background, turn it on. Get yourself settled in. Let's begin. Picture a stretch of land in what mapmakers today call the Black Desert in the country we now know as Jordan. It does not look like much now. Dry, cracked and endless with little but pale stones stretching toward the horizon. But 14,400 years ago this same ground was softer. Wild grasses moved gently across low hills. Small streams still ran nearby, quiet enough to hear at night. And scattered across that land lived small groups of people who never stayed anywhere for very long, following the seasons the way birds follow warmth, moving whenever the food around them began to run thin. Researchers now call these people the Natufians, a name borrowed from a valley where their remains were first uncovered many years ago. They had no writing, no cities, no wheels. Most of what they owned could be carried on their backs, and yet buried beneath 1/2 meter of dust ash and centuries of forgotten dirt, they left something behind that would one day quietly shake the entire foundation of how we understand human history. Life for these people moved to a very different rhythm than ours. Mornings likely began with the soft sound of dry grass stirring in the morning air instead of an alarm clock, and with the smell of a fire being coaxed back to life from the embers of the night before. Meals were never guaranteed. Some days brought fresh meat from a successful hunt. Other days brought nothing but root seeds and whatever wild plants could be gathered before the heat of midday set in. There was no pantry to fall back on, no shelf of canned food waiting in reserve. Every single meal had to be found, gathered or hunted almost always by hand, almost always the same day it would be eaten. Now picture this. One particular evening so long ago that the very shape of the land has since changed. An older woman kneels beside a low fire, her knees pressed into the cool earth. Beside her, a young girl watches closely, copying every movement with small, careful hands. Between them sits a flat stone worn smooth in the middle, from years, maybe decades of the exact same motion. Wild grain is poured across its surface, and a second stone held firmly begins to grind it down, back and forth, over and over, slow and steady, the way you might rock a fussy baby to sleep without even noticing you are doing it. The grain gathered that day was not the wheat we know, now tall golden and perfectly uniform in neat rows. It was wild einkorn, a thin, hardy ancestor of modern wheat, along with barley and the starchy roots of a marsh plant called clubrush. None of it grew in tidy fields. It grew scattered wherever the land happened to allow, and gathering enough for a single meal could take the better part of a day. There was no guarantee of a harvest, no guarantee of rain the following season, just whatever the land offered and the patience to work with it. There is no rush here, no timer, no one checking a clock because clocks do not exist yet. Just patience and the quiet trust that comes from doing something with your hands enough times that your body remembers it, even when your mind wanders elsewhere. Slowly, the crushed grain becomes something close to flour. Water is added a little at a time until it forms a rough, sticky paste. And then, with the kind of confidence that only comes from repetition, that paste is pressed flat and laid gently against the heated stones at the edge of the fire. There was no recipe passed down in a worn little notebook, no cookbook waiting on a shelf, just instinct trial, a bit of luck, and the simple comfort of watching something ordinary slowly turn into something warm enough to share. And if your own sourdough starter has ever quietly died in the back of your refrigerator, take some comfort in this. Even the very first bakers in human history were mostly just guessing too. Now let's fast forward tens of thousands of years to a very different scene. Between 2012 and 2015, a team of archaeologists began carefully digging into a small stone structure at a site now known as Shubaika 1. Inside, hidden beneath a collapsed roof, they found something unusual. 2 fireplaces built one directly on top of the other, remarkably well preserved after all that time. And resting within the ashes of those fireplaces sat 24 small charred fragments. At first glance, most of us would have swept them away without a second thought, mistaken for nothing more than burnt scraps of plant matter. But researchers do not sweep things away so quickly. They study them. Under a powerful microscope in painstaking patient detail, they examined the structure of each fragment, searching for meaning in something as small and unassuming as a single burnt crumb. What they found stopped them in their tracks. These were not simply burned remains of wild plants. They were bread. Actual recognizable bread made from ground wild wheat barley and the roots of that same marsh plant clubrush, mixed with water shaped by careful hands and cooked slowly over hot stone or glowing ash. And here is the detail that changed everything. This bread was 14,400 years old. For decades, historians had assumed a fairly simple story that bread could only exist after farming began, after human beings settled down planted fields on purpose and slowly domesticated wild wheat into something more manageable. It was one of those assumptions so widely accepted that almost nobody thought to question it. This discovery proved it wrong. It is easy from where we sit now, surrounded by refrigerators and delivery apps, to imagine early humans as simple, almost primitive figures, more concerned with staying alive than with anything resembling skill or care. But making bread from wild grain is not a simple task. It requires knowing exactly which plants are safe to gather. It requires the patience to grind grain by hand for hours at a time. It requires understanding fire well enough to cook something evenly, without burning it down to nothing. This was not an accident stumbled upon once by pure chance. It was knowledge tested and quietly passed down, likely across many generations, long before anyone thought to write any of it down. Before this discovery, the oldest known evidence of bread came from sites in Turkey and parts of Europe dating to a period roughly 10,000 years ago, well after farming had already begun. What was found at Shubaika 1 pushed that timeline back by more than 4,000 years and placed the very first loaf firmly in the hands of people who'd never farmed a single field in their lives. Some researchers believe that grinding grain by hand was more often than not the work of women spending long repetitive hours each day at this single demanding task. Wrist bones and joints uncovered from sites of this period show real physical signs of that labour, the same kind of wear a person might develop today after years of doing the exact same motion again and again without rest. It is a small, quiet detail, but it tells a much bigger story. Long before bread had a name, long before it ever appeared on a table set for royalty, it already carried the quiet weight of human effort, patience, and care. Someone chose to spend hours of their short, difficult life turning wild grass into something warm enough to offer another person. Not because a king demanded it, not because a temple required it, but because even then, without written language, without a permanent home to return to human beings, already understood something we still feel today deep in our bones. Food made with your own hands and shared beside a fire with people you love is one of the oldest forms of comfort there is. This discovery did more than simply push back a date on some distant timeline. It quietly reshaped an entire theory about why humans became farmers in the first place. For a long time, the assumption ran in one direction: only humans settled down first, and bread followed naturally afterward, almost as a pleasant afterthought. But now many researchers are asking a very different question. What if it happened the other way around? What if the craving for bread, that soft, warm comfort, was actually one of the very things that pushed early humans toward farming at all? What if wanting more of one simple food helped quietly shape the entire course of human civilization? It is a strange thought sitting here now warm and safe to imagine that the beginning of everything we call progress might trace back to something as small and as deeply human as wanting a good meal. And maybe that is not so different from us. Think about it for a moment. A grandmother's kitchen filled with the smell of something rising in the oven. A loaf pulled apart by hand and passed around a table on a difficult week when nobody quite has the words for how they are feeling, but everyone reaches for a piece anyway. That instinct to comfort each other with something warm we made ourselves apparently did not begin with our grandmothers at all. It began by a small fire in the desert 14,400 years ago with someone whose name we will never know, but whose instinct it turns out we still carry. It is worth pausing on this for a moment. Today almost every culture on earth has its own version of this same idea. Warm cornbread on a Sunday table in the American South. A crusty baguette carried home under someone's arm in a French neighborhood. Naan pulled straight from a hot clay oven somewhere in South Asia. Different names, different shapes, completely different flavors, and yet underneath all of it the very same impulse. Take something plain, add firewater and time, turn it into something you can share. That impulse is not modern. It is not even close to modern. It is 14,400 years old, and it is still sitting on tables all over the world tonight. That single fire in that quiet corner of the desert was never going to be enough on its own. Because once human beings tasted what a little patience and a little heat could create, there was no real going back to simply wandering and hoping the next meal would appear on its own. That same hunger, not just for food, but for something steady, something they could return to again and again without wondering where it would come from, was about to push humanity toward one of the largest changes it would ever make. A change that would trade the freedom of wandering for the quiet weight of roots, and plant the very first seeds on purpose of everything that was still to come. So here's a question worth sitting with for a moment in the quiet of wherever you happen to be tonight. If you knew somehow that settling down in one place would make you shorter, sicker, and more likely to lose a child before its 5th birthday, would you still do it? It sounds like an easy answer from here wrapped in blankets with a refrigerator full of food just a few steps away. But somewhere around 12,000 years ago in the hills of what is now southeastern Turkey, real people faced a version of that exact question. Not all at once and not with any of the numbers we have today. Just slowly, one harvest at a time, without ever fully realizing how much they were about to change. There is a volcanic mountain range in that region called Karakada, dark, rugged, and largely forgotten by most of the modern world. And yet, if you trace the genetic history of wheat, the actual wheat back far enough almost every stalk of it, in a bakery, a farm or a supermarket today leads back to wild grass that once grew across those very slopes. Scientists confirmed this by comparing the genetic makeup of modern domesticated einkorn wheat to wild populations gathered from across the entire region, once called the Fertile Crescent, a stretch of land running from the eastern Mediterranean through what is now Iraq and Iran. Out of all of it, one population stood out as the closest match the wild einkorn still growing on the slopes of Karakadar. In other words, somewhere on that one mountain range, something happened that would eventually feed billions of people who would never know its name. It is tempting to imagine that region as some kind of ancient paradise, lush and generous, practically begging to be farmed. Its old nickname alone suggests abundance, but much of that landscape was and still is dry, rocky and unforgiving for large stretches of the year, closer to scrubland than to garden. Farming there was not an easy shortcut to comfort. It was a real gamble season after season on rainfall that could not be predicted, and soil that gave back only what people were willing to work for. If anything, the difficulty of that land may be part of the reason farming took root there at all. Comfortable places rarely force people to experiment. Difficult ones sometimes do. Wheat was not travelling alone on this journey. Alongside it came barley, lentils, peas, chickpeas, and a handful of other plants together, sometimes described by researchers as the founder crops of agriculture, because nearly every farming tradition that followed across the ancient world traces its roots back to this same small cluster of plants, domesticated within a few thousand years of one another in roughly the same stretch of land. And it did not stop there. Around that very same broad window of time, separated by thousands of miles with no possible contact between them, other groups of people were independently learning to plant rice in parts of Eastern Asia and corn in parts of what is now Mexico. Different crops, different continents, no shared knowledge passed between any of them, and yet remarkably similar decisions made independently by people facing a remarkably similar set of pressures. To understand what actually happened on that one mountain, it helps to understand something wild wheat does that most of us have never once thought about. In the wild, a ripe stalk of wheat is built to scatter. The moment its seed is ready, the stem holding it becomes brittle and snaps scattering grain onto the ground below so it can take root and grow again the following season. That is simply how wild grass survives. It does not wait around to be harvested. But every so often, purely by chance, a single plant would carry a small genetic quirk, a stem just a little tougher than the rest, one that refused to snap and scatter its seed so easily. In the wild, this was actually a disadvantage. A plant that fails to scatter its own seed struggles to spread on its own. But the moment human hands entered the picture, that disadvantage flipped completely upside down. Picture someone walking through a field of wild grain with the simple stone-edge blade cutting stalks close to the ground. The wheat that shattered easily had already dropped most of its seed onto the earth before it was even reached. But the tougher stalks, the ones holding on stubbornly, were exactly the ones still full of grain when the blade passed through. Harvest after harvest, season after season, without anyone planning it, without anyone drawing up an idea on parchment or announcing a clever new invention, people were quietly favouring the very plants that clung to their seed the longest. And here is a detail I find almost unbearably human. Nobody woke up one morning and decided to invent farming. It was not a single flash of genius from one particularly clever person. It happened slowly by accident, dragged forward year after year, by nothing more than ordinary people repeating the same task, gathering food, the easiest way they knew how. Farming, in other words, was not so much invented as it was stumbled into one harvest at a time, across what is generally believed to have been several centuries, maybe longer. Now picture a small community living near that same mountain range watching this shift happen without fully understanding it yet. Someone notices that the toughest stalks, the ones that stayed full even after the harvest, seem to be the ones worth keeping. Maybe an older man sets a handful of that grain aside instead of grinding all of it into flour right away. Maybe a young mother, tired of walking farther and farther each season to find enough wild grain to feed her family, presses a few seeds into the soil near where they usually camp just to see what might happen. There would have been no guarantee it would work, no neighbour to ask for advice because nobody had ever done this before, not on purpose. And yet when the following season came and green shoots pushed up through the very soil where those seeds had been pressed down, something shifted. Food no longer had to be searched for across miles of open land. It could at least sometimes be grown close to home, on ground people already knew. That single decision, small, uncertain, and almost accidental, would eventually anchor human beings to the land in a way they had never been anchored before. A few thousand years after that first hesitant planting, not far from that same region, one of the earliest and largest farming communities on record rose out of the plain of south-central Anatolia. Archaeologists call it Çatalhöyük, and if you saw it from above it would look nothing like a town as we understand one today. There were no streets. Homes were built wall to wall, packed together so tightly that people walked across the rooftops just to get from one house to another, climbing down through a hole in the ceiling using a wooden ladder to reach the room below. Inside, the air would have been thick with smoke from small hearths, the walls warm to the touch, the ceilings low enough that a tall visitor today might need to duck. There were no windows looking out onto a street because there was no street to look out onto. Light came mostly from that same hole in the roof, along with whatever a small fire could offer once darkness fell. At its largest, this settlement is believed to have held several thousand people, an enormous number for its time, tucked into a maze of mud brick rooms without a single road running between them. Inside many homes, walls were plastered smooth and painted, with scenes of hunting of wild bulls, of vultures circling overhead, a strange contrast for a community that spent most of its daylight hours tending crops rather than chasing game. It is almost as though, even as people settled into farming life, some older, wilder part of who they had been refused to be fully left behind, resurfacing instead on the painted walls of their own homes. Inside those homes, families lived, cooked, slept, and even buried their dead beneath the floor, generation layered quietly on top of generation, beneath the very room where daily life continued on above them. It is a strange image to sit with families going about ordinary life, cooking a meal, mending a tool directly above the resting place of relatives who came before them, and yet for the people who lived there, this was simply home. Here is where this story gets a little more complicated and honestly a little uncomfortable. For a long time, farming was taught as a clear step forward for humanity, an upgrade plain and simple. More food, more stability, more people, and in one sense that part is true. Populations did grow faster than they ever had while people were still wandering and foraging. But researchers who study ancient bones have found something the simple version of this story tends to leave out. Skeletons from early farming communities, including people who lived and died at Çatalhöyük, tend to be noticeably shorter than the hunter-gatherers, who came before them often by more than an inch on average. Their teeth show far more decay, likely from a diet suddenly leaning heavily on starchy grain, instead of the wider, more varied diet their ancestors once relied on. Bones show more signs of infection and more evidence of nutritional stress during childhood. One well-known review of ancient skeletal remains found signs of declining health, Across the large majority of farming societies studied almost every single one once people traded a wandering life for a settled one. It might surprise you to learn that some modern hunter-gatherer communities still living traditionally today, studied carefully by anthropologists, often eat a wider, more varied diet than many of us managing a weekly grocery list, and in some documented cases spend considerably fewer hours each day working for their next meal than early farmers likely did. It is worth pausing on that for a moment. We tend to assume that hunting and gathering meant a constant, desperate scramble for survival, while farming meant safety and ease. The actual evidence paints a far messier picture, one where the wandering life may in certain ways have been the gentler one all along. So here is the question worth sitting with. If farming in many real and measurable ways made individual lives shorter and harder, why did it spread across nearly the entire world, and why did it never really reverse? The answer seems to lie less in comfort and more in numbers. A hunter-gatherer typically needs a wide stretch of land to feed even a small group, since wild food is scattered and unpredictable. A farmer, even a struggling one, can coax far more food out of a single smaller plot of land season after season, simply by staying put and tending it patiently. That difference meant farming communities could support more children more often, even while each individual life carried more physical strain. Slowly, more mouths fed on a fixed piece of land began to outcompete and outnumber the freer, more spread out hunter-gatherer groups nearby. Not because farming life was easier, but because it was in a strange and almost accidental way more efficient at producing more human beings. And once grain could be stored, something else quietly crept into human life for what appears to be the first time: the idea of having more than your neighbour. A full storage pit of grain was wealth, in a way that fresh meat from a hunt which had to be eaten or shared quickly before it spoiled never really was. Grain could sit, it could be counted, it could be guarded and passed down, and wherever something can be stored, counted and guarded, questions about who owns it and who does not tend to follow closely behind. Many historians consider this quiet shift, the birth of stored surplus, to be one of the earliest roots of inequality itself, the moment human communities first split, however gently at the start, into those who had a little more and those who had a little less. Ever notice how a nature documentary about ants stockpiling seeds underground can feel strangely familiar? Maybe that is because human beings have been doing our own version of exactly that for roughly 12,000 years now, just with slightly nicer containers and considerably more paperwork. It is strange to think that something as ordinary as a grain storage pit might be one of the oldest ancestors of the modern pay stub or the bank statement, or that faint twinge of comparison so many of us still feel scrolling through a phone late at night. We like to imagine progress as a straight upward line, but real history rarely moves that cleanly. It bends. It trades one problem for another, and it asks quiet, uncomfortable questions along the way. If you have ever weighed the freedom of unpredictable, flexible work against the safety of a steady paycheck and a fixed address, you have in a strange and distant way been standing exactly where those first farmers once stood, weighing freedom against security without ever quite being able to have both at once. By the time those early farming villages had settled into a steady rhythm, something had changed for good. Wheat and barley were no longer things to be searched for across miles of open country. They were something to be grown, harvested, stored and guarded season after season close to home. But growing the grain, it turned out, was really only half of the problem solved. The other half, the question of what to actually do with it, once it filled those storage pits, was about to be answered in a place far from those quiet mountain villages along the banks of a river that flooded with almost perfect predictable timing every single year. There in the warm, damp air near that river, someone would leave a batch of grain and water sitting out just a little too long and stumble completely by accident onto something that would not just feed people, but would quietly rise bubble and transform an ordinary, flat, humble food into something entirely new, something that once discovered could never really be forgotten again. That river, the one we left our story beside, had a name long before anyone called it the Nile in any language we would recognize today. The people who lived along its banks called their land Kemet, which means roughly the Black Land, and they meant it literally. Once a year, almost like clockwork, the river rose spilled gently over its banks and left behind a thin, dark layer of silt across the fields nearby. Then it receded right on schedule as though the land itself had simply exhaled. Nowhere else in the ancient world could a farmer count on that kind of consistency. No mystery, no guessing. Just a river that flooded, retreated, and quietly handed over fresh, fertile soil year after year, almost like clockwork you could set a life around. That kind of reliability changes everything for a farming community. Compare it to almost anywhere else nearby, and the difference becomes obvious. Rivers elsewhere in the region could flood without warning, arrive too early, too late, too much, or too little, turning farming into a yearly gamble. The Nile, by contrast, behaved almost like a patient, generous relative, showing up reliably enough that an entire civilization could be built around trusting it completely. Grain grown in Kemet did not just feed a family through one difficult season. It produced enough again and again to be stored stacked and set aside. And it is in exactly this kind of place, with grain sitting around far longer than anyone in that earlier mountain village could have imagined, that our story takes its next strange turn. Because somewhere along that riverbank, quite by accident, someone left a bowl of grain and water out a little too long. Somewhere in a mud brick kitchen near the riverbank, someone whose name history never bothered to record went through the same motions they repeated most mornings, grinding grain, mixing in water, patting the dough into something flat enough to bake quickly over hot coals. It was routine work, the kind done half by memory hands moving faster than thought. But on this particular morning, or perhaps this particular evening, the routine broke just slightly, just enough. Picture it for a moment. A simple mixture of flour and water mixed the same way it always had been, flattened and set aside, perhaps because the person preparing it was pulled away by a crying child, or a task left unfinished, or simply the ordinary chaos of a full day. Hours pass. Maybe even a full day and night, and when they return to it, something has changed. The mixture is no longer flat and still. It is bubbling faintly, almost breathing larger than it was before, with a smell that is sharp, slightly sour, and completely unfamiliar. Most people understandably would have thrown it out without a second thought, but someone somewhere curious, or simply unwilling to waste good grain, baked it anyway. If that sounds a little familiar, maybe like the version of yourself who has at some point sniffed a suspicious container from the back of the refrigerator and decided to risk it anyway, you are in good company. Human curiosity towards slightly questionable food has clearly been with us for a very long time. What came out of that fire would have looked nothing like the flat, humble bread that had fed people for thousands of years before it. This loaf was taller, softer, riddled on the inside with small air pockets, light in the hand in a way flatbread never was. Have you ever wondered what that very first bite must have felt like, biting into something familiar that had somehow impossibly transformed into something else entirely? It must have felt less like cooking and more like witnessing something close to magic. Of course, it was not magic at all, even though it must have felt that way at the time. What that person had stumbled onto without any way of knowing it was a living organism, a wild strain of yeast invisible to the eye, floating quietly in the air and resting on the surface of the grain itself. Given warmth, moisture, and a little time that yeast wakes up and begins quietly feeding on the natural sugars in the dough, releasing tiny bubbles of gas as it works. Trapped inside the dough, those bubbles do exactly what bubbles do. They expand and lift, and the dough rises around them slowly, patiently, without anyone touching it at all. Bread had learned quite by accident how to grow. This was not simply a good guess passed down through folklore. Researchers studying residue left inside ancient Egyptian pottery, some of it recovered from bakeries dating back roughly 5,000 years, have identified the chemical fingerprints of yeast fermentation baked directly into the vessel walls. It stands among the earliest confirmed pieces of physical evidence anywhere in the world of people deliberately using yeast to leaven bread rather than simply eating it flat. It is worth pointing out that bread was not the only thing rising along that riverbank around this same time. Beer in ancient Kemet followed a strikingly similar process grain water, and time fermenting into something new. In fact, some archaeologists have gone so far as to suggest a strikingly provocative idea that the desire for fermented alcoholic grain drinks may have played just as large a role in pushing early societies toward farming as bread itself did, maybe even more. It remains a debated theory, not something every historian agrees on, but it is hard to deny how closely bread and beer moved together through Egyptian life, so closely that many bakeries and breweries of the period were run out of the very same buildings by the very same hands. Beer in ancient Kemet was nothing like the occasional treat we might picture today. It was closer to a dietary staple, thick only mildly alcoholic, and often safer to drink than water taken directly from a river shared with animals, farmland runoff, and an entire civilization's daily business. Children drank a version of it. Labourers received it as part of their pay. Even temple offerings included it alongside bread, the two treated as a matched pair, almost inseparable, feeding both body and spirit in the same gesture. Here is where the story of Egyptian bread starts to reveal something else, something a little less comfortable than a happy kitchen accident. Bread in Kemet was never just food. It was currency, status, and religion all folded into the same simple loaf. And nowhere does that show up more clearly than in one of the most persistent myths in all of ancient history, one that still shapes how many people imagine Egypt today. For centuries, the popular image of pyramid construction involved rows of enslaved people whipped forward under a brutal sun, forced to drag stone blocks for a ruler's personal glory. It is a dramatic image. It has shown up in films, in paintings, in casual conversation. And archaeology has spent the last few decades quietly, patiently taking that image apart. In the 1990s, archaeologists uncovered an entire settlement near the Giza Plateau, a workers' town complete with bakeries, breweries, medical facilities, and organized housing. The people who built these monuments were not prisoners. Many were farmers themselves called into labor during the months when the Nile's floodwaters made their own fields impossible to work anyway, alongside skilled permanent laborers who worked on the pyramids as a trade. Records recovered from this period suggest that an ordinary laborer received something in the range of 10 loaves of bread and a generous share of beer as a daily ration, along with meat on a fairly regular basis, food considered quite good for the era. When some of these workers died, they were buried in modest tombs near the very monument they helped build, with jars of bread and beer placed beside them for the journey into the next life, an honour no society grants to people it considers disposable. So why does the slave myth still linger so persistently in popular imagination, even now, decades after archaeology quietly corrected the record? Much of it traces back to a Greek historian who visited Egypt centuries after the pyramids were already ancient history even to him, and who wrote down a second-hand account of forced labour without ever verifying it against the actual builders, whose tools, homes, and even tombs were sitting right there the entire time, waiting quietly to be properly listened to. Perhaps the myth lingers because the truth is somehow less dramatic, and yet if you sit with it for a moment, it is actually the more remarkable story. Not a tale of cruelty and forced suffering, but of coordination, logistics, and an entire state apparatus, organised well enough to feed house and pay tens of thousands of ordinary people on schedule for years at a time, using little more than bread, beer, and careful record-keeping. In some ways, that achievement is just as staggering as the pyramids themselves, and bread in Kemet did more than fill stomachs on a construction site. It followed people into the afterlife itself. Egyptians believed the dead still needed to eat, so tombs from modest workers' graves all the way up to royal burial chambers were regularly stocked with actual loaves of bread along with the clay moulds used to shape them. Archaeologists have recovered real physical loaves thousands of years old, preserved by the same dry desert conditions that famously preserved human bodies. In more than one case, loaves pulled from sealed tombs still held their shape well enough that researchers could identify the exact type of grain used and even the rough outline of the mould that formed them after resting undisturbed in the dark for well over 3,000 years. There is something quietly moving about that a piece of someone's actual dinner prepared by hands that turned to dust millennia ago, waiting patiently in the dark for someone to finally come looking. Do you ever wonder on an ordinary evening what someone thousands of years from now might guess about your own life, just from whatever happens to survive in your kitchen? Egyptian tomb paintings show bread in astonishing variety: round loaves, triangular loaves, braided loaves, bread shaped like animals, or human figures more than 30 distinct forms documented from art and surviving moulds alone. Bread was so deeply woven into daily and spiritual life that wages themselves were sometimes recorded not in coins, since coins as we understand them did not yet exist there, but literally in loaves and jugs of beer, a system of payment that placed bread at the very centre of what it meant to have value at all. But not all bread carried equal weight, and this is where the story turns a little darker and a lot more human. The fine white bread served at wealthy tables was carefully sieved, made from the best emmer wheat relatively free of the grit and debris that came from grinding grain between two stones. Bread eaten by labourers and common farmers received no such care. It was often coarse, heavy, and mixed with tiny fragments of sand and stone dust, carried in from the grinding process itself, sometimes even from wind-blown sand settling over open bakeries. Over a lifetime of eating that same gritty bread meal after meal, year after year, the effect on the human body was brutal in a very literal sense. Examinations of Egyptian mummies, both common people and members of the royal family, revealed teeth worn down dramatically, sometimes ground almost flat by decades of chewing, sand-laced bread exposing nerves, leading to abscesses, infections, and in some documented cases, illness serious enough that scholars believe it contributed to a pharaoh's death. Bread, the very food that built an empire's workforce and comforted its dead, was quietly wearing down the mouths of everyone who depended on it, kings included. It is a pattern that in some quieter form has never fully disappeared. Even now, the price and quality of a loaf of bread can say something about who is eating it, whether it comes from a bakery advertising something artisanal and stone-milled or the cheapest shelf at a corner store. Kemet simply wrote that same pattern into the teeth of its people, where it could not be hidden or explained away. There is something almost poetic in an uncomfortable way about a food that could symbolize wealth, provide payment for building the most enduring monuments in human history, accompany the dead into eternity, and still slowly damage the teeth of nearly everyone who relied on it. It is rarely one thing, is it? Not comfort alone and not hardship alone, but both baked into the very same loaf, We tend to picture ancient Egypt through gold and monuments through kings and towering statues, and it is easy to forget that behind almost every one of those achievements sat something as ordinary as a warm loaf of bread, rationed out by the thousands baked in mud brick ovens and occasionally quietly wearing away at the very people who depended on it to survive. If you have ever bitten into a piece of bread from a bakery that still uses old-fashioned stone milling and felt an unexpected crunch you did not order, you have in a very small and far less painful way tasted a tiny echo of exactly this. It is a strange kind of connection to reach across 5,000 years and land of all places on your own back teeth. Egypt gave the world leavened bread, and along with it a surprisingly modern set of questions about labour value and who gets the fine loaf versus who gets the gritty one. But Egypt was never the only civilization discovering what a great dependable river could do for a hungry population. Further east along two other rivers entirely winding through land far less forgiving than the black soil of Kemet, another set of cities was rising for the very first time in human history. There the flooding was nowhere near as gentle or predictable, and the grain that grew there had to be measured, guarded, and accounted for with an entirely new kind of seriousness. Bread was about to meet something it had never truly needed before priests, scribes, and towering temples built in no small part to make absolutely certain that not a single loaf and not a single grain ever went unaccounted for. Rivers, it turns out, do not all behave the same way, and the two that cradled the next chapter of this story were nothing like the gentle, dependable Nile we just left behind. The Tigris and the Euphrates could flood without warning, sometimes violently, sometimes not at all, leaving farmers guessing year after year instead of simply trusting the calendar. And out of that very unpredictability, strangely enough, grew something far more organized than anything Kemet ever needed to build. Imagine standing on a riverbank where the water might rise gently this year and violently surge through your fields the next, with no reliable pattern to plan around at all. That kind of uncertainty does not invite patience, it demands intervention. When a river cannot be trusted to behave itself, people have exactly two choices: give up on farming near it or build something clever enough to control it anyway. The communities who settled between these two rivers in the land later called Mesopotamia chose the second option, and it changed the shape of human civilization completely. They dug canals. They built irrigation channels stretching for miles, redirecting water to fields that the river itself refused to reach reliably on its own. But a canal, unlike a river, does not maintain itself. It silts up. It breaks. It requires constant labour, constant coordination, and someone willing to make sure that the farmer at the far end of the canal received just as much water as the farmer standing closest to the source. Somebody had to organise all of this, and out of that need, the very first true cities in human history began to rise along these riverbanks, places like Uruk, humming with a level of coordination the world had never once seen before. By some estimates, tens of thousands of people eventually lived within its walls, a population size that would have been unimaginable to anyone still living the way those early farmers near Karakadar once had. Feeding a city that size meant tracking harvests across dozens of surrounding villages, coordinating canal maintenance schedules, and settling disputes over whose field received water first. None of that could be managed by memory alone, no matter how sharp any single administrator's mind might have been. Here is where the story takes a turn I still find almost impossible to believe, even though I have looked through the evidence more than once. We tend to imagine that writing humanity's greatest tool for expressing thought must have been invented for something noble. Poetry, perhaps. Prayer. Love letters. Great stories meant to outlive their tellers. The truth, as it turns out, is far less romantic and honestly a little bit funny once you sit with it. The very first writing on record was not a poem or a prayer or a declaration of love. It was a receipt, long before anyone pressed a wedge-shaped mark into wet clay temple. Administrators in this region were using small clay tokens shaped like tiny cone spheres and discs to keep track of goods flowing in and out of their storehouses. A token for a jar of oil, a different token for a measure of grain. As settlements grew larger and the goods being tracked grew more numerous, someone eventually pressed those tokens into the soft surface of a clay tablet before sealing them inside for safekeeping, leaving a physical impression behind. And somewhere in that process, someone realized something rather clever. Why bother sealing the actual tokens inside the clay at all, when the impression alone told you exactly what was being counted? From there, it was a short step to simply drawing the symbol directly onto the tablet's surface. Simple pictures at first, a bundle of grain, a jar, a head bent toward a bowl meaning to eat, gradually sharpened over generations into the wedge-shaped strokes we now call cuneiform. One of the oldest surviving tablets from this period now resting quietly behind glass in a museum far from the riverbank where it was written, records nothing more dramatic than an allocation of beer. Writing, quite literally, was born out of the need to make sure nobody's grain or beer went missing. Think about that the next time you glance at a receipt from a grocery store and toss it aside without a second thought. You're holding a direct if humble descendant of humanity's very first written language. Isn't it strangely comforting in an odd sort of way to know that literacy itself began with something as ordinary as bookkeeping, before humanity ever wrote down a single myth, a single love song or a single joke? It first wrote down who owed what to whom and how many loaves of bread a labourer was due at the end of a long week. Civilization, it turns out, learned to write because it needed to remember its receipts. And there was a great deal to keep track of. At the centre of each of these early cities sat a temple, often built atop a raised platform of mud brick called a ziggurat, rising above the flat river plain like a small deliberate mountain. These temples were not simply places of worship. They functioned as the closest thing this world had to a central bank collecting grain as offerings and taxes, storing it in vast quantities, and then redistributing it back out to priests, labourers, craftsmen, and the poor in carefully measured rations. An entire class of professional scribes existed for the sole purpose of tracking these transactions, tablet after tablet, harvest after harvest. Grain itself was measured using a standardized unit called a sealer, roughly equivalent to a modern litre, a small enough detail that it rarely makes it into popular retellings of ancient history, and yet it represents something enormous, an entire society agreeing in writing on exactly how much a single ration of barley should weigh, no matter which temple, which city, or which official happened to be doing the measuring. One of the largest and best preserved of these temple platforms, the great ziggurat built in the city of Ur, still rises out of the southern Iraqi desert today, its lower levels reconstructed, its upper stories long since worn away by time, a quiet mud brick monument to just how seriously this civilization took the business of storing and accounting for its grain. Bread itself, alongside beer, became one of the most common units of payment recorded on these tablets, so central to daily wages that entire careers were built around counting it accurately. Now beer deserves a proper pause here because Mesopotamia's relationship with it took a strikingly different shape than the one we just left behind in Egypt. In Kemet, bread and beer were made side by side in the very same buildings, almost interchangeable in purpose. Here along the Tigris and the Euphrates, an entirely specialized type of bread was developed for one purpose, alone not to be eaten, but to make beer. It was called bapir, a dense twice-baked barley loaf deliberately dried out so it could be stored for months without spoiling later, crumbled into water to kickstart fermentation. We actually know the general method in surprising detail thanks to a clay tablet written down more than 3,500 years ago that takes the form of a hymn of praise to Ninkasi, the goddess of beer, describing how the bapir was baked, crumbled, and mixed with sweet dates and aromatics before being left to ferment. Whether this hymn was intended as a literal recipe or simply a poetic tribute sung by brewers while they worked remains gently debated among scholars, but either way it stands as one of the oldest surviving descriptions of a brewing process, anywhere on record disguised rather beautifully as a song of devotion to a goddess. Picture a group of women singing quietly to themselves as they work, praising Ninkasi by name for handling the dough, for tending the fermenting vat, for the pleasant bubbling sound rising from a jar left resting in a cool corner of the room. Their labour and their worship were in that single ordinary moment indistinguishable from one another. Bread, in other words, was not always meant to be eaten at all. Sometimes it was meant to transform into something else entirely, a strange quiet kind of alchemy performed daily by ordinary women, since brewing in Mesopotamia was by tradition largely their domain, and bread carried a deeper meaning here too, one that shows up not in tablets of grain counts, but in one of the oldest surviving works of literature ever written down by human hands. In the story of a legendary king there is a wild man named Enkidu, raised among animals, running with gazelles drinking from the same watering holes as wild beasts entirely outside human society. When Enkidu is finally brought into contact with civilization, the very first thing done to change him is not a lesson in language or a gift of clothing or a place to sleep. He is offered bread and beer for the first time in his life. According to the old poem, he did not know what to do with either at first, staring at the food set before him, the way an animal might stare at something unfamiliar. He is gently urged to eat and drink because this, he is told, is simply the custom of the land. And once he does, something in him visibly shifts. He is described afterward as glowing, lighter, more human, ready for the first time to wash, to dress, to live among people rather than beasts. The wild animals who once accepted him as one of their own are said to run from him afterward, sensing correctly that he no longer belongs entirely to their world. Isn't there something quietly moving about that detail that the animals could tell before any person needed to say a word simply from the way he now smelled or moved or carried himself, that something fundamental about him had changed? Not stronger, not smarter necessarily, just no longer wholly wild. It is a remarkable detail to sit with for a moment. Long before anyone in this region had a word for agriculture or civilization, as concepts, the people living through this transformation had already written their own answer to the question of what actually separates a wild creature from a human being. Not tools, not fire, not even language in this particular story. Bread and beer shared at a table among other people. It is in its own way one of the earliest surviving arguments ever recorded for the idea that eating together deliberately is what makes us fully human, given how seriously bread and beer were treated in this society tied to labour to worship, and apparently even to the very definition of civilized life. It should come as no surprise that Mesopotamian rulers eventually decided all of this deserved formal legal protection. One of history's earliest and most famous law codes carved into a tall stone pillar, under the authority of a Babylonian king, devoted several of its rules specifically to fair dealing in grain and beer. That same stone pillar, standing well over 7 feet tall and covered top to bottom in carefully carved script, is perhaps better remembered today for a very different, far harsher line about an eye being owed for an eye. But tucked in among those famous blunt punishments sit a handful of laws concerned with something far more mundane, and in its own way far more telling about what this society actually valued day to day. Tavern keepers, most of them women, were legally required to accept proper measures of grain as payment for drink, rather than shortchanging customers with unfair cash substitutes. Those caught cheating people out of what they had rightfully paid for faced a remarkably severe punishment, being drowned. It is a strange thing to imagine an ancient king carving laws about fair beer pricing into stone, meant to last for millennia, and yet here we are still able to study it today, still slightly amused, still, if we are honest with ourselves, not entirely surprised that someone somewhere was always trying to cheat a customer out of a proper pour. There is something almost tender about how much effort an entire civilization poured into protecting bread and beer, specifically of every possible thing they might have chosen to regulate first. Have you ever filled out a form or kept a careful record of an expense just to make sure nobody could accuse you later of shortchanging them? If so, in a strange, distant sort of way, you have more in common with the Sumerian temple scribe than you might expect. Somewhere on a clay tablet that has survived roughly 5,000 years, an anonymous administrator is quietly permanently vindicated, having correctly recorded exactly how many loaves a particular worker was owed on a particular afternoon. There is a kind of comedy in that if you let yourself sit with it, the idea that some of the very oldest surviving human writing amounts essentially to an argument someone was determined to win. The impulse to write things down so nobody gets cheated, so effort gets properly counted and properly repaid, is apparently one of the oldest and most stubbornly human instincts we carry, older in fact than most of what we consider modern civilization to even be. Grain, once it could be measured, taxed, stored, and legally protected, had become something far bigger than food. It had become the very foundation upon which entire governments, religions, and legal systems were built, tracked meticulously, generation after generation, one careful tablet at a time. But not every civilization that inherited this idea would treat bread quite so administratively, quite so soberly. Somewhere else along a very different coastline under a very different sky, an empire was coming that would take this same humble loaf and turn it into something closer to spectacle, a tool wielded openly in crowded arenas and busy public squares to keep an entire restless population calm, entertained and quietly obedient, one free loaf at a time. Spectacle, as it turns out, is a strange word to use for something as ordinary as a loaf of bread, and yet that is exactly the word ancient writers themselves reached for when describing what Rome eventually did with it. There is a phrase that has survived from a Roman satirist writing around the end of the 1st century, mocking his fellow citizens for caring about only two things anymore: bread and the games held in the arena. Loosely translated, he complained that the people who once decided elections, commanded armies, and controlled everything now longed for only two things: bread and circuses. It was meant as an insult, a jab at how far the descendants of senators and generals had supposedly fallen content now to trade real political power for a full stomach and a good show. And yet underneath that insult sits one of the most fascinating political experiments in the ancient world. Here is the actual story behind that famous complaint, and it began long before any emperor ever sat on a throne. In the closing years of the Roman Republic, a reformer named Gaius Gracchus pushed through a law allowing citizens to purchase grain at a fixed subsidized price, a modest attempt to steady a population increasingly squeezed by debt, land loss, and rising food costs. It was controversial even then. Over the following decades, that modest subsidy grew piece by piece, reform by reform. A politician named Clodius pushed the policy further still, and by the middle of the 1st century before the Common Era, grain in the city of Rome had become entirely free for qualifying citizens, no payment required at all, only proof of citizenship. By the time Augustus reorganized the entire system into something more permanent, somewhere in the range of 200,000 citizens, at times closer to 300,000, were registered to receive a monthly ration of grain, delivered through an office created specifically for this purpose, run by an official whose entire career revolved around one task, making absolutely certain the grain supply never failed. It is tempting from where we sit now to hear all of this, and picture a city full of idle citizens sitting back and living comfortably off the state's generosity, while contributing nothing in return. That picture, satisfying as it might feel, misses something important. Rome's economy relied heavily on enslaved labour, which meant free citizens were frequently pushed out of the very jobs that might have supported them, undercut by workers who cost their employers nothing beyond basic upkeep. A free Roman baker, farmer, or labourer simply could not compete on price with an enslaved workforce owned outright by wealthy landholders and merchants, and there was no meaningful path around that arithmetic. The city had also grown far beyond what its surrounding farmland could feed on its own swollen, with people drawn in by opportunity, by war, by the simple, gravitational pull of a capital that dominated an entire known world. The grain dole was never simply a gift. It was closer to a pressure valve, a deliberate mechanism to keep a densely packed, occasionally desperate population from turning that desperation into open revolt. And once emperors discovered how effectively this particular pressure valve worked, they rarely stopped at grain alone. Over the following generations, the state gradually added olive oil, wine, pork, and on especially significant occasions, outright gifts of cash distributed directly to the crowd to mark a coronation, a military triumph, or simply an emperor's desire to remind the city exactly who was responsible for keeping their stomachs full. This was not subtle propaganda. It was not meant to be. And it worked precisely because everyone involved understood the transaction taking place, even if nobody said it quite so plainly out loud. There are documented moments across Roman history when the grain supply faltered even briefly, and crowds turned dangerous almost overnight, gathering outside palaces, shouting down officials, occasionally rioting outright, a blunt reminder to whichever emperor happened to be watching that this particular bargain only worked in one direction. Keep the bread coming and the crowd stays calm. Let it falter even once, and an entire city could remember quite suddenly that it still had teeth. Whether that makes it compassionate policy or cynical crowd control likely depends on which Roman senator you happen to ask. And honestly, historians still debate the question today. Would you call a policy generous if the alternative to offering it was watching your own capital city burn? For centuries, that monthly ration came as raw grain, which citizens still had to carry home mill and bake themselves, or pay someone else to do it for them. That changed under the Emperor Aurelian in the final decades of the 3rd century, when the ration shifted from sacks of wheat to something far more immediate, actual loaves of finished bread distributed directly to the people waiting in line. The reasoning was practical as much as generous. A loaf of bread is far harder to resell, hoard, or smuggle out of the city than a sack of raw grain sitting quietly in someone's storeroom. Turning the dole into bread meant turning it into something that could only really be used one way, eaten right there by the person standing in line for it. Baking bread for an entire capital city reliably every single day required an enormous, tightly organized workforce, and that workforce eventually formalized into its own official guild, the Bakers' Collegium. On the surface, this sounds almost cozy, a respected trade association, the kind of professional guild you might picture in a medieval fairy tale, complete with its own privileges and its own seat of honour. And for a while it truly was something close to that. Bakers gained real status, real influence, occasionally real wealth. But as the empire aged and grain politics grew more desperate, the state gradually tightened its grip on this profession until something troubling took hold. Bakers, and eventually their children and their children's children, were legally bound to remain bakers, forbidden by law from selling their bakeries, forbidden from simply walking away and choosing another trade, because Rome could not risk losing a single one of them. A guild that once symbolized pride and craftsmanship had quietly hardened into something closer to hereditary obligation. If you were born into a baking family in the later empire, in a very real sense, your career had already been chosen for you before you ever touched a single grain of wheat. Even marrying outside the trade could complicate things, since the law took a particular interest in keeping baking property, baking skills and baking obligations tied firmly within the same families generation after generation, whether those descendants had any love for the work or not. Do you ever wonder how something can start out as an honour, and slowly, without anyone quite noticing the exact moment it happened, curdle into an obligation nobody's allowed to escape? Rome's bakers lived that exact transformation. We do not have to imagine entirely what these bakeries looked like, because in one particular Roman city time itself happened to stop mid-task. When the eruption of Mount Vesuvius buried Pompeii in the year 79, it preserved dozens of working bakeries almost exactly as they stood that final morning, complete with tall, cone-shaped stone mills once turned by donkeys or by hand-grinding grain into flour, just steps away from brick ovens still holding the ash-covered remains of actual loaves carbonized by heat rather than destroyed by it. Some of those loaves still bear faint markings pressed into the crust before baking a maker's identifying stamp, evidence that even in an ordinary neighborhood bakery someone cared enough about accountability or reputation to sign their work. Walk through the excavated ruins today, and you can still stand in the exact spot where a baker once stood, facing an oven mouth still stained dark with 2,000-year-old soot, the millstones beside it worn into a smooth, permanent groove by however many thousands of slow, patient circles a tired donkey once walked. In one particular oven, excavators found something almost impossible to look at without feeling a small, quiet shock: 81 identical round loaves still sitting exactly where a baker had left them the moment everything went wrong. Each one scored neatly into 8 equal wedges and tied around its middle with a cord ready to be pulled apart and shared at a table that never got the chance to gather around it. One baker in particular left behind something far more permanent than a stamped loaf. His name was Marcus Vigilius Eurysaces, and everything about his life suggests he began it as a slave, likely brought to Rome from somewhere in the Greek-speaking East. Somehow, through skill, ambition, or simply extraordinary luck, he was freed, built a successful baking and grain contracting business, one large enough that he may well have supplied bread to the Roman army itself, and became wealthy enough to do something almost unheard of for a man of his origins. He built himself an enormous tomb standing more than 30 feet tall, just outside the city gates, shaped unmistakably like the tools of his own trade, its surface ringed with round openings believed to represent grain measures, its upper band carved with the detailed, unmistakable frieze, showing the entire bread-making process from start to finish grain, arriving by cart donkeys turning the mill dough being kneaded, loaves being weighed and stacked. A simple inscription identifies him plainly as a baker and a contractor. Nothing more. His wife, a woman named Atistia, was remembered there too, her ashes reportedly kept in a container shaped like a bread basket, a strange and oddly tender detail for two people whose entire fortune had been built loaf by loaf. and yet that tomb has outlasted the tombs of senators, of generals, of men born into far greater privilege than he ever was. A former slave remembered for 2,000 years not for conquest but for bread. Not every loaf in Rome carried equal weight, socially speaking, and the empire was remarkably direct about saying so out loud. Fine, carefully sifted white bread, sometimes called simply the bright loaf, sat on the tables of the wealthy. A coarser, heavier loaf made with less refined flour fed the ordinary citizen standing in line for the dole. And at the very bottom of the scale sat a rough, bran heavy bread associated with slaves and with punishment food deliberately kept plain enough to mark exactly where a person stood in Roman society, without anyone needing to say a single word about it out loud. Roman writers occasionally used these bread categories almost as shorthand for a person's entire station in life, praising a modest man for contentedly eating the coarser loaf or mocking a glutton for demanding only the finest, whitest bread despite having done nothing to earn it. You could quite literally tell someone's social standing simply by looking at what kind of loaf sat on their table that evening. There is something almost dizzying about how much of Roman daily life, political, social, and economic, all at once ran directly through something as unglamorous as bread. It fed the poor, it calmed potential riots, it built entire bureaucratic careers. It gave a former slave a monument grander than most senators ever received. If you've ever noticed how the food someone can afford still quietly signals something about their circumstances today, whether that shows up in a grocery cart, a restaurant choice, or simply what sits in a cupboard, toward the end of a long month you're looking at an instinct considerably older than most of what we call modern society. Rome simply had the confidence to give that instinct an actual name on the loaf itself, rather than leaving it as the quiet, unspoken thing it usually remains for us. And yet, for all its careful bureaucracy, all its guilds, all its stamped loaves and marble monuments, Rome's relationship with bread carried a hidden fragility running underneath the entire system. The wheat that fed the capital rarely grew anywhere near it. Much of it arrived by ship from provinces like Egypt and the fertile coastline of North Africa, hauled across open water on a scale that demanded a functioning fleet, secure ports, and stable weather almost as much as it demanded fertile soil. A capital city of roughly 1 million people at the height of empire was never truly feeding itself. It was feeding itself through a supply chain stretched dangerously thin across the entire ancient world, dependent on favourable weather-functioning ports and provinces that stayed loyal, or at least stayed conquered, one that worked beautifully right up until the moment it did not. When those distant provinces eventually slipped from Roman control centuries later, the empire did not just lose territory on a map. It lost the ability to reliably fill its own bakeries, a slow grinding vulnerability that many historians count among the quieter, less dramatic pressures that helped wear the Western Empire down from the inside. Rome had built an extraordinary system for turning grain into bread and bread into political stability, but it had also almost accidentally built an empire that could not entirely feed itself without leaning on lands far beyond its own borders. That particular lesson would echo forward for centuries long after Rome's arenas fell silent, and its bakers' guild dissolved into memory into a very different kind of world entirely. A colder world without a central grain office, without free loaves waiting in an orderly line, without any emperor keeping the whole fragile system from tipping over. What replaced it was something far more local, far more personal, and in many ways far more unforgiving a hunger, just as real split sharply down the middle between two very different kinds of loaves, one dark and coarse enough for a farmer's table, and one pale and soft enough for a lord's. A colder world, we said, and it truly was in more ways than the weather alone. Rome's tidy bureaucracy of grain officials and stamped loaves gave way over the centuries that followed its collapse to something far more scattered, far more local, and in many corners of the continent far more unforgiving. There was no more central authority guaranteeing a free loaf to a few 100,000 grateful citizens. No more Prefectus Annonae losing sleep over a shipping schedule from across the sea. Bread now depended almost entirely on whichever small patch of land you happened to be born onto, and more importantly on whoever happened to own it. A single manor, a single lord, a single mill, a single oven often decided how well or how poorly an entire village would eat for generations. Let's start with something almost nobody expects to hear about medieval dinner tables, because it still catches me off guard every time I think about it properly. For much of the Middle Ages, especially among households wealthy enough to host a proper meal, people quite literally ate off bread. Thick, dense slices of bread cut from loaves, deliberately baked several days earlier, and left to firm up served as edible plates called trenchers. Meat stew, thick sauces, all of it, was piled directly onto this dense stale slab which soaked up the juices underneath without falling apart. There was a real skill to it, and even a written instruction manual survives from medieval France, advising a young wife exactly how old the bread needed to be, typically 3 or 4 days, so that it would hold together properly beneath a heavy meal. Once dinner ended, the trencher itself now soaked through with meat drippings, and sauce was either eaten by whoever was hungry enough to want it, or handed off to servants to dogs waiting under the table, or in more charitable households and monasteries, gathered up and given directly to the poor waiting quietly at the gate outside. For someone with very little, a single trencher heavy with someone else's leftover dinner could be an entire nourishing meal in itself. It is a strange thing to picture now, isn't it? An entire piece of tableware you are also expected to eat, assuming you were lucky enough to be the one holding the knife rather than waiting outside the gate for whatever survived the meal. Before any of that bread could reach a table, though it first had to survive an entirely different kind of medieval institution, one with far less charity attached to it. In most of England and across large parts of continental Europe, an ordinary farming family was not legally permitted to simply grind their own grain at home. The mill belonged to the local lord, and custom, backed by law, required every tenant to bring their harvest there, and nowhere else, paying a portion of the flour itself as a toll for the privilege. This obligation had an actual namesuit of mill, and it was taken remarkably seriously. Families caught quietly grinding grain at home using small hand querns, simple stone tools anyone could technically own, risked fines, confiscated grain, occasionally even the loss of a horse to a lord's officials. In one particularly vivid case, an abbot in charge of a wealthy monastery grew so frustrated with tenants secretly grinding their own flour that he ordered their hand querns seized and physically smashed the broken stones, repurposed into paving for his own floor, a deliberate, almost theatrical warning to anyone tempted to try the same thing. Monasteries themselves, though, could occasionally offer a strange kind of shelter from this same harsh system, provided you were counted among the monks rather than the surrounding tenants. Ancient monastic rule books, some written more than 1,000 years before this period, specified an exact daily bread ration for every monk delivered without fail, regardless of harvest, regardless of the chaos unfolding in the fields outside the monastery walls. For a hungry farmer watching his own family's supply shrink with every bad season, that kind of guaranteed daily loaf, however modest, must have looked less like simple piety and more like something close to genuine security. Isn't it strange to imagine getting fined or worse simply for wanting to grind your own wheat in your own kitchen? And it is worth noting that the miller standing at the centre of this entire arrangement rarely earned the community's trust either way. A common medieval riddle asked what the boldest thing in the world might be, and answered itself with a joke that still lands today: a miller's shirt, since it wraps around a thief every single morning without a hint of shame. Between a lord who controlled the mill and a miller widely suspected of skimming a little extra flour off the top for himself, the ordinary farmer bringing in a sack of grain rarely walked away feeling like the winner of that particular transaction. Once the grain finally became bread and reached a market stall, an entirely different layer of regulation took over, and this is where medieval England produced one of its longest surviving pieces of consumer protection law. In the year 1266, King Henry III formally established what became known as the Assize of Bread and Ale, a detailed system tying the legal weight of a loaf directly to the current market price of wheat. The price itself barely moved a farthing here, a halfpenny there, but the size of the loaf you received for that fixed price would quietly shrink or grow, depending on how expensive grain happened to be that particular season. Bakers who cheated selling loaves that came up short on the scale faced consequences that were humiliating in the extreme. Some were fined. Repeat offenders could be dragged through crowded streets on a wooden frame called a hurdle, their undersized loaf carried ahead of them on a pole so the entire watching crowd understood exactly what crime they were being punished for. Others ended up locked in the public pillory, their heads and hands trapped between wooden boards, while the neighbours they had cheated were free to pelt them with whatever happened to be close at hand. Court records from this period still preserve individual names attached to individual humiliations. One London baker was dragged the entire distance from the Guildhall through the busy heart of the city, past the very colleagues who would have recognised his face. Another caught mixing sand into his dough to stretch the weight of his loaves, made that same miserable journey toward the prison at Newgate, his adulterated bread hoisted on a pole ahead of him the entire way, so that everyone he passed understood precisely why he was being punished. Perhaps you have heard the phrase baker's dozen 13 items given for the price of 12 without ever quite knowing where it came from. This law is almost certainly the reason. Facing such severe punishment for coming up even slightly short, bakers began deliberately tossing in one extra loaf with every dozen sold a small cheap insurance policy against a pillory sentence. What began as a nervous act of self-protection eventually calcified into simple tradition, one that quietly outlived the law that originally inspired it by centuries long. After anyone buying a dozen rolls from a modern bakery has any idea they are participating in a habit born entirely out of fear of a medieval pillory. Not every loaf under this system was created equal, and medieval regulators were remarkably specific about it. The finest, whitest bread made from wheat flour, sifted not once, but twice to remove every trace of bran, was called wastel bread, and it belonged almost exclusively to wealthier tables. Slightly coarser breads carried their own names and their own separate weight allowances a step down, called cocket bread. Another sweeter variety called simnel sliding step by step, down toward the dense, dark, mixed grain loaf that filled most ordinary stomachs, often blended from rye, barley, peas, or whatever grain a particular harvest happened to favour that year. A household's entire social standing could sometimes be read straight off its bread basket, the way a modern visitor might size up a home by glancing at what fills the refrigerator. One of England's earliest town charters, drawn up for the city of Winchester at the very start of the 13th century, spells out something wonderfully revealing about this hierarchy. White bread was required to weigh noticeably less than the coarser brown loaf, and yet it sold for considerably more money, purely because people believed sifted purity was worth paying extra for. In a strange twist, historians still find quietly amusing that belief was almost entirely backwards. The coarser, cheaper, supposedly lower status loaf packed with bran and whole grain was very often the more nutritious meal of the two. The peasant's daily bread was in more than one sense secretly the healthier choice all along, even if nobody eating it at the time would have believed you for a second. There is another quiet correction worth making here too. It is easy to assume the poor simply received a smaller amount of bread than the wealthy scrap stretched thin across a hungry household. Several detailed studies of medieval diet actually suggest something more surprising, that the sheer quantity of bread eaten across different classes was often remarkably similar. The real divide was almost never about how much bread reached your table. It was about which colour that bread happened to be. All of this regulation, all of this careful weighing and pricing and punishing existed because bread truly stood between an entire population and starvation, and every so often the system broke completely. In the spring of the year 1315, relentless rain began falling across northern Europe and simply refused to stop. Fields that should have ripened under a normal summer sun stayed cold, waterlogged and rotting instead. Grain that did survive often would not properly dry, turning mouldy in storage before it could even reach a mill. The following year brought more of the same brutal weather, and then the year after that until nearly 3 consecutive harvests failed one after another across a continent that had no meaningful safety net beyond whatever a lord, a monastery or a king happened to have stored away. Wheat prices in some regions climbed by several 100% within a matter of months. In the region of Lorraine alone, records describe prices rising more than 300%, pushing bread entirely out of reach for ordinary families almost overnight. The animals fared no better than the fields. A wave of disease tore through cattle and sheep herds across the same stretch of years, cutting some local populations down by as much as 80%, which meant even milk, cheese and meat. The fallback options in a bad grain year simply were not there to fall back on. People desperate enough turned to foraging bark roots and wild grasses from the forest floor, and in the very worst documented cases resorted to eating the seed grain itself, the precious reserve meant for next year's planting, a decision that guaranteed even deeper starvation the following season. Even King Edward II of England was not immune. Historical records describe him stopping at the town of St Albans in the summer of 1315, travelling with his usual entourage of nobles' guards, and servants expecting the standard comfort of a royal household on the move, only to discover that his own kitchens could not find enough bread to feed him and his travelling court. Imagine the quiet panic among his stewards, scrambling through a town where even wealthy households had little to spare, trying to explain to their king why the most basic food in the entire kingdom had simply run out. It was a strange, almost unbelievable moment where the crown itself briefly went without a small human crack in the usual armour of royal privilege. If bread could humble a king even for one uncomfortable afternoon, it is worth asking what that says about everyone standing several rungs further down the same ladder. Have you ever gone without something you assumed would simply always be there, only to suddenly understand in your own body just how much of daily life quietly depends on it? A pantry that always seemed to restock itself. A tap that always ran clean. It rarely takes very long once that assumption breaks even slightly to remember exactly how thin the line has always been between comfort and its absence. This was the medieval bargain in the end, spelled out plainly in flour and grain, and the colour of a person's daily loaf. Bread told you where you stood socially, economically, sometimes even legally, depending on which mill you were permitted to use and which pillory awaited the baker who shortchanged you. And yet underneath every single one of those very earthly, very political arrangements, something else was quietly happening as well, something that had nothing to do with lords' mills or market weights at all. The very same substance being taxed, rationed, and occasionally fought over by desperate kings and hungry peasants was also at that very same moment being lifted onto altars across the continent and treated as something entirely different, something sacred enough to represent the presence of God Himself, shared among believers, regardless of whether their own daily loaf back home happened to be pale and soft or dark, coarse and barely enough. Something sacred, we said, lifted onto altars while kings worried about weight and price down below. And that is really where this next part of the story belongs, not in a marketplace or a manor house, but in the quiet, candlelit spaces where bread stopped being measured in pennies and farthings altogether and started being treated as something closer to eternity. No pillory waits for anyone in this part of the story. No hungry king searching desperately for a loaf. Just centuries of ordinary people across an astonishing range of cultures quietly agreeing that this one particular food deserved to be treated differently than everything else on the table. Let's begin somewhere specific, a small upstairs room on an evening that Christian tradition places right before a devastating betrayal. According to the Gospels, a man shared a final meal with his closest followers, and that meal itself, most scholars agree, was almost certainly a Passover meal, the same ritual dinner Jewish families had been observing for centuries by that point, built around unleavened bread, and the retelling of an ancient escape from slavery in Egypt. The room would have been simple, a low table oil lamps, perhaps the smell of roasted lamb and bitter herbs already filling the air before anyone spoke a word about betrayal or bread at all. During that meal, according to Christian scripture, the man broke a piece of bread, handed it to those around the table, and told them quite plainly that it represented his own body offered on their behalf. Whatever you believe about the nature of that moment, historically speaking, it planted a small, humble piece of bread directly at the center of an entirely new faith, one that would eventually spread across continents this same bread had never even heard of yet. Within a few generations, that same simple gesture, breaking bread and sharing it around a table, had become the single most repeated ritual act in the growing religion, performed in languages the original participants would never have recognized, in buildings taller than anything that existed in their lifetime. For the centuries that followed, exactly what happens to that bread during a church service became one of the most fiercely debated questions in the entire history of Christianity, argued over by popes, professors, and eventually entire nations willing to go to war over the answer. In the year 1215, a major council of the Catholic Church formally settled on a word to describe what many believers already held to be true, that the bread once blessed by a priest does not merely represent the body of a divine figure, but is mysteriously completely transformed into it, while still looking, tasting and feeling exactly like ordinary bread to anyone examining it. This teaching became known as transubstantiation, and for centuries it stood as settled doctrine across most of Western Christianity, repeated in cathedrals from one end of the continent to the other, largely unquestioned by the ordinary worshippers kneeling in the pews, to make sense of exactly how something could keep every outward property of bread, while its underlying nature changed completely. Medieval theologians borrowed heavily from ancient philosophy, drawing a careful distinction between what a thing appears to be and what a thing actually is underneath that appearance, a surprisingly technical argument built around a very simple piece of food. Then, roughly 3 centuries later, that settled question cracked wide open. During the Reformation, a movement that reshaped the religious map of an entire continent, reformers disagreed sharply and often bitterly over exactly what that bread had become. Some, like the reformer Martin Luther, still believed something real and divine was truly present in the bread itself, even while rejecting the precise Catholic explanation of how. Others, like the Swiss reformer Huldrych Zwingli, argued the bread was never physically transformed at all, that it remained simply bread. A powerful symbol meant purely to help believers remember a sacrifice, rather than a literal ongoing miracle repeated on every altar. In the year 1529, these two men sat down together at a castle to hash the disagreement out face to face, and by most accounts they left the meeting further apart than when they arrived. To this day, different Christian traditions around the world still hold meaningfully different views on this exact question, and I will simply say this. Whichever side of that centuries-old debate resonates with you personally, it remains a remarkable thing that an entire religious movement once split in part over the precise nature of a piece of bread. A third reformer, John Calvin, tried to chart something of a middle course between these two positions, arguing that while the bread itself never physically changed, believers who ate it in faith were nonetheless spiritually lifted into a real meaningful connection with the divine, even among people trying to find common ground. In other words, the exact status of that small piece of bread refused to settle into easy agreement. Long before any of that debate existed, bread already held a different, equally profound kind of weight within Judaism, the very tradition that Passover meal itself belonged to. Each spring, Jewish families gathered to retell the story of the Exodus, the biblical account of enslaved Israelites fleeing Egypt in such urgent haste that there was no time to let their bread dough properly rise. What they carried with them instead was flat, unleavened and plain, and to this day that same style of bread called matzah is eaten throughout the week-long Passover holiday as a direct edible link to that ancient flight toward freedom. It is sometimes referred to quite deliberately as the bread of affliction, humble and unadorned on purpose, a reminder that comfort and freedom are not always the same thing, and that sometimes the most meaningful bread you will ever eat is the plainest one on the table. Around family tables each spring that same flat, cracker-like bread is passed from hand to hand while the story of the escape is told aloud, often by the youngest person present, so that even a child too young to remember any other Passover still carries the taste of that ancient hurry on their tongue. And yet Judaism also holds an entirely different bread tradition, nearly the opposite in spirit, reserved for the weekly day of rest called Shabbat. This bread, called challah, is rich, golden and unmistakably beautiful, usually braided into interlocking strands before baking. 2 whole loaves are traditionally placed on the table together, honouring an old story about manna, the miraculous food said to have fed the wandering Israelites in the desert, which reportedly fell in a double portion every Friday, so that no one would need to gather food on the sacred day of rest that followed. Even the braiding itself carries meaning for many families, strands twisted together like the fingers of clasped hands, said to represent unity or love, or the intertwined threads of an entire community bound to one another. Before the meal officially begins, the 2 loaves are often covered with a decorative cloth, a small, gentle tradition rooted in the idea that even a loaf of bread deserves its dignity, and should not, in a manner of speaking, be embarrassed by having to wait its turn for a blessing. The shape of the loaf can shift with the calendar too. Around the Jewish New Year, many families bake it round instead of braided, a small visual reminder of a cycle beginning again with no clear start or end. During other solemn days on the calendar, some bakers shape the dough into a ladder meant to suggest climbing towards something higher. Interestingly, a similar golden braided loaf appears on Greek Orthodox Christian tables each spring at Easter, called tsureki. Its 3 twisted strands said by some to echo the Holy Trinity, rather than the 12 tribes of Israel, 2 entirely separate faiths independently arriving at almost the same beautiful loaf for reasons that only partly overlap. Travel further across the same ancient region, and you will find an entirely different religious tradition treating bread with a reverence that borders on the sacred, even without a single specific bread ritual written directly into its founding scripture. In many Muslim cultures stretching from North Africa through the Middle East and deep into Central Asia, bread is simply never thrown away. Sayings attributed to the Prophet Muhammad urge believers to treat bread with genuine respect as a direct blessing from the earth, and sky and generations of families have passed down small quiet rituals around this idea. One frequently cited teaching preserved through generations of Islamic tradition instructs believers to honor bread specifically because it comes from the blessings of both heaven and earth, together a food that required rain from above and soil from below to exist at all. Even stale, mouldy, or otherwise inedible bread is rarely simply discarded in many of these communities. It is instead set aside for birds, for stray animals, or left in a place where scavenging creatures might find it, so that even food no longer fit for a person can still complete its purpose of feeding something living. In parts of Egypt, the everyday word for bread aish literally translates to life itself, a small linguistic detail that says almost everything you need to know about how central this one food has remained to an entire culture's sense of what it means to survive and be cared for. Across the wider region, children are taught that if a piece of bread ever falls to the ground, it should be picked up immediately, sometimes kissed, occasionally, touched to the forehead before being placed somewhere safe and clean, never simply left underfoot or thrown into the trash. In Uzbekistan today, that same instinct still plays out on ordinary streets, where a stray crumb noticed on the pavement might be gently lifted, kissed 3 times, and set respectfully aside, an old habit that has clearly outlived whichever century first gave birth to it. Have you ever stopped mid-bite and considered that the food on your plate might deserve more thought than you usually give it? Here is what I personally find most moving about laying all 3 of these traditions side by side. A transformed body on an altar defended and debated by councils and kings. A humble, hurried loaf eaten in memory of freedom, hard-won passed hand to hand around a family table every single spring without fail. A crumb lifted off a sidewalk and kissed before being set gently aside by someone who may never once have set foot inside a church, a synagogue, or a mosque belonging to either of the other 2 traditions. These are 3 profoundly different belief systems shaped by different scriptures, different centuries, and often, if we are honest, genuine historical tension between their followers, tension that has at various points across history turned violent and tragic. And yet at the exact same time, every single one of them somehow arrived at the same quiet conclusion that this particular food deserves more reverence than an ordinary meal ever would. Have you ever noticed how the things human beings agree are sacred often say more about our shared nature than the things we argue about? Maybe that shouldn't surprise us as much as it does. Every single one of these traditions, after all, grew up somewhere along that same ancient stretch of wheat fields we have been tracing since the very beginning of tonight's journey, the same general region where a wild grass first learned to stay attached to its stalk long enough for a human hand to gather it. Perhaps reverence for bread was never really a matter of theology to begin with. Perhaps it is simply what happens when an entire civilization owes its survival to a single fragile, edible miracle, repeated season after season for so many thousands of years that gratitude eventually hardened into something people were willing to call holy. Bread, it turns out, has spent thousands of years quietly negotiating between 2 entirely different worlds, one measured in farthings, tolls, and pillories, and another measured in blessings, braids and kisses offered to a fallen crumb, Sacred in the hands of the poor, sacred in the hands of the pious, and yet still underneath every ritual and every doctrine, exactly the same simple mixture of flower water and patience that a nameless hunter-gatherer once pressed against a hot stone beside a fire in the desert. But there was one more world bread was about to enter one where it would trade its humility for something far more theatrical altogether. Because while peasants argued with millers and priests, argued with reformers somewhere in the candlelit banquet halls of Europe's grandest palaces, bread was quietly being handed an entirely new job description. No longer content simply to feed a body or represent a soul, but dressed up, gilded, sculpted, and paraded before kings and queens meant now to dazzle an entire room rather than simply fill a single stomach. Picture the room itself for a moment before we even get to the food. Long tables draped in white linen, hundreds of candles throwing soft flickering light across gold plate and painted ceilings, tapestries stitched with hunting scenes, and family crests hanging heavy along every wall, an entire hall built and decorated for exactly one purpose, to announce without a single word being spoken exactly how powerful the person seated at the head table truly was. Musicians tuned quietly in a corner. Servants moved in practiced silence, trained for years to carry enormous platters without so much as a rattle of silver. This was the world bread was stepping into now, a world where a simple loaf was no longer nearly theatrical enough on its own. At grand European banquets, particularly across England and France, cooks and confectioners developed something called a subtlety, sometimes spelled sottlety. In the older records, an elaborate sculpture brought out between courses, built from sugar from almond paste known as marzipan, sometimes from bread dough itself moulded and painted into castles' ships, saints' coats of arms, or entire miniature battle scenes. These were not meant simply to be eaten, or in many cases not eaten at all. They were meant to be admired, discussed and remembered table decorations engineered to leave a room full of powerful guests quietly impressed and occasionally quietly intimidated. Sometimes they carried a written motto, or a few lines of verse tucked somewhere into the design meant to be announced aloud by a herald before the next course arrived, turning dinner itself into a slow, structured performance rather than a simple meal. Here is a detail I find lovely. If you trace the technique back far enough, the earlier sugar sculptors are believed to have worked centuries earlier in the Middle East sultans and caliphs, commissioning confectioners to shape refined sugar into elaborate decorative forms, a skill that slowly travelled west along the same trade routes that once carried spices and eventually landed on the banquet tables of European kings who had absolutely no idea they were borrowing an art form from a different faith and a different continent entirely. Real accounts of these feasts survive in surprising detail. At the coronation banquet of King Henry V of England, guests were presented with a sculpted swan surrounded by a flock of cygnets, each one carrying a small strip of poetry gripped delicately in its sugar beak. At the coronation feast held for his new Queen Catherine, shortly after the subtleties turned devotional and symbolic one, depicting a pelican resting on its nest, a traditional emblem of piety, another showing St. Catherine herself in the middle of a heated debate with a group of pagan scholars, and a third featuring a heraldic tiger, gazing directly into a mirror, an image contemporaries would have instantly recognized as a clever layered comment on the new marriage itself. None of this was random decoration. Every single figure on that table was chosen and understood by the guests as a carefully coded message, closer to a political cartoon rendered entirely in sugar and pastry than to anything we might now call simple dessert. One Burgundian duke took this even further at a banquet held in the middle of the 1400s staged specifically to rally support for a military campaign following the fall of a great Christian city to Ottoman forces. Alongside the usual sculpted courses, guests reportedly watched an actor dressed as the church herself ride into the hall on an elephant reciting verses about the plight of Christians overseas, while the assembled nobles were invited one by one to swear an oath of support over the very food in front of them. The campaign itself never actually happened, but the theatre of that single dinner was remembered and retold for generations afterward. And these were not small quiet affairs. At the banquet celebrating an archbishop's installation in the year 1465, historical records describe a first course containing 17 separate dishes, a second course with 20, and a third with 23. And that count does not even include the subtleties presented between each one. Imagine the kitchen required to produce that single afternoon, dozens of cooks roasting pits running for days beforehand, an army of servants simply to carry each course the length of the hall before it went cold, and somewhere behind it all, a head cook whose entire reputation rested on whether the final subtlety drew gasps or polite disappointed silence. Somewhere in the middle of all that spectacle sat what may be one of the strangest dishes ever recorded at a formal royal feast, an enormous pie that once cut open in front of the assembled guests released a flock of live birds directly into the hall. Yes, you heard that correctly, and if it sounds oddly familiar, there is a reason for that. A cookbook published in Italy in the middle of the 1500s, later translated into English, includes exact instructions for building a pastry shell tall enough to conceal a hollow chamber underneath baked separately from the birds themselves so as not to harm them, then assembled together at the very last possible moment before the dish was carried out to the table. A hole was cut into the base of the crust the live birds packed carefully inside the hollow space, and the whole creation presented to the room looking for all appearances like an ordinary if enormous pie, releasing the birds only at the very moment the crust was cut specifically so that they might fly out over a delighted, astonished dinner table. Historians studying Old English nursery rhymes have long noticed the curious resemblance between this real culinary trick and the opening line of a very famous children's song, the one about 24 blackbirds baked into a pie, which when opened begin to sing before a king. Nobody can prove with certainty that the rhyme grew directly out of this exact banquet tradition, and folklorists remain honestly divided on the question, but the timing and the sheer specificity of the imagery make the coincidence almost impossible to ignore. Sugar itself deserves its own moment here because in this era, it was not the cheap ordinary pantry item it is today. It arrived in Europe slowly expensively imported across enormous distances from lands most guests at these banquets would never personally visit, and for centuries it was treated less like food and more like a rare edible jewel, sold in small guarded quantities by apothecaries alongside genuine medicine. Owning enough sugar to build an entire sculpture out of it was quite literally wealth made visible and edible at the same time. At one especially lavish wedding banquet held in the German city of Jülich in the late 1500s, guests were not greeted with the single subtlety, but an entire table covered in sugar figures, a miniature replica of the host's own castle. Standing in one corner, a small sugar forest complete with animals and fruit trees filling another, and the family's coat of arms rendered again and again across the display in case anyone in attendance had somehow failed to notice whose wedding they were attending. Sometimes this kind of spectacle was not really about a single family at all, but about an entire nation's pride. In the summer of 1520, King Henry VIII of England and King Francis I of France met near Calais for what became known as the Field of the Cloth of Gold, 18 days of tournaments, dancing and feasting, staged in an enormous temporary encampment built specifically to outshine the opposing kingdom. English accounts from the event describe fountains built to flow continuously with wine rather than water, thousands of sheep slaughtered to feed the tens of thousands of attendees, and even a pair of monkeys gifted from a distant sultan, covered head to tail in real gold leaf, wandering freely among the noble guests. Neither king was hosting a wedding or celebrating a coronation. They were simply trying to convince one another through sheer culinary and material excess that their own kingdom was the wealthier, grander, and more powerful of the two, an entire diplomatic summit conducted largely through the language of extravagant food. Even households a rank or two below royalty caught the same fever eventually. By the time Elizabeth I sat on the English throne, wealthy households across the country had taken to serving their own smaller version of the same idea, a rich sculpted marzipan centerpiece known locally as marchpane, moulded into castles' coats of arms or simple decorative patterns, and set proudly at the centre of the table for a final sweet course. It was in a sense the aristocracy's grand sugar spectacle quietly shrunk down to fit inside an ordinary manor house dining room, proof that even a diluted taste of royal theatre was worth chasing if the real thing remained forever out of reach. Access to this kind of display was never left to chance either. Formal laws in England dating back to the early 1300s actually restricted how many dishes a household could serve and specified certain foods that only the highest ranks of nobility were legally permitted to eat at all, regardless of whether they could afford it. A wealthy merchant might have the fortune to purchase peacock or swan for his own table and still be legally forbidden from serving it simply because his family had not been born into the right rank. Status, in other words, was not simply about wealth. It was written directly into the law course dish by dish, and yet underneath every one of these carefully staged displays of power sat a much older, gentler idea about food that the nobility rarely paused to consider. The English word companion, believe it or not, comes directly from an old phrase meaning one who shares bread with you, come together and pain is bread, the same root word for bread we have been tracing since a river valley in ancient Egypt. Even in a hall built entirely around exclusion and hierarchy, the very language being spoken at that table quietly remembered a time when sharing a loaf rather than showing it off was the entire point. Perhaps the strangest banquet spectacle of all, though, involved no sugar and no birds whatsoever. At a 17th century feast hosted for King Charles I and his queen, one particular pie was brought to the table, cut open with appropriate ceremony, and out stepped an actual person, a celebrated court performer of very small stature, standing upright among the guests, to general astonishment and delight, bowing to the very monarchs he had just startled half out of their seats. He would go on to live an extraordinary life at court in his own right, but for that one particular evening he was quite literally presented to the room as though he were the meal itself. Have you ever wondered what it must have felt like to sit at one of these tables, dazzled, entertained, and quietly aware that every single ounce of sugar in front of you represented money that could have fed an entire village for a season? That contrast was never accidental. It was in its own way the entire point of the display. A hungry kingdom outside the walls was not a contradiction of the feast. It was the whole reason the feast needed to look quite so impossibly grand in the first place. Power, after all, is rarely satisfied simply existing quietly in the background. It generally wants an audience, and failing that, at the very least, it wants a very large pie. This, in the end, is the peak of the mountain. Bread has been climbing since a small fire in a quiet desert first turned wild grain into something warm enough to share. From ashes to gilded sugar castles, from a single flat loaf pressed against a hot stone to an entire table, built to represent a nobleman's coat of arms in edible form. But mountains, as anyone who has ever climbed one already knows, only ever point toward one place, after the summit, and bread's long, glittering moment at the very top of human ambition was about to come crashing back down to earth harder and faster than anyone feasting in that candlelit hall could possibly have imagined. Because for every gilded sugar castle built to impress a room full of nobles, there was a field somewhere beyond the palace walls, quietly failing to produce enough grain to feed the people who grew it, and eventually the distance between those two tables, one groaning under sculpted sugar, the other nearly empty, would grow far too wide for even the most powerful crown in Europe to hold together. That distance we just spoke of between a table piled high with gilded sugar castles and a field that could no longer feed the people working it was never going to stay quiet forever. Every mountain, no matter how carefully built, eventually meets gravity, and nowhere would that distance eventually snap shut with more force or more consequence than in 18th century France, a kingdom that had spent generations perfecting the art of the royal feast, while quietly forgetting just how thin the patience of a hungry population can wear. To understand exactly how much weight a single loaf of bread carried in ordinary French life at this point, consider this. For most working families in Paris, bread made up somewhere close to 3/4 of the entire household diet, and even during a perfectly normal year with no shortage and no crisis at all, the poorest labourers might still spend close to half of everything they earned simply keeping their family fed with it. There was no cushion built into that arrangement, no room for a bad harvest, a shipping delay, or a sudden spike in grain prices. When bread rose even slightly in cost, an enormous portion of the population felt it immediately in their stomachs within days. A king could survive a poor harvest without ever noticing the difference on his own table. A laundress, a cobbler, or a day labourer could not. In the spring of 1775, that fragile arithmetic broke completely. A newly appointed government minister named Turgot, convinced by a fashionable new economic philosophy that removing price controls on grain would eventually make the market more efficient and self-correcting, lifted long-standing regulations just before a poor harvest hit the country. It was in theory a reasonable idea. In practice, the timing could hardly have been worse. Merchants, no longer restricted by law, began buying up grain wherever it remained cheap, and reselling it wherever shortages had driven prices sharply upward. Within weeks, more than 300 separate riots broke out across the region surrounding Paris, ordinary people storming granaries and mills, seizing sacks of flour, and in many recorded cases insisting on paying what they considered a fair traditional price for it, rather than simply stealing it outright. Historians studying this period have a term for that instinct, a moral economy, the deeply held belief common across centuries of European history that bread prices belong to the whole community, not simply to whoever happened to be selling it that week. Under this older, unwritten code, a merchant who hoarded grain during a shortage to sell later at a higher price was not seen as a savvy businessman. He was seen as something closer to a thief stealing from the collective right of ordinary people to eat. This particular uprising became known afterward as the Flour War, and although it was eventually put down by soldiers with several hundred rioters arrested, and only a small handful ever executed it, left behind a lesson. Almost nobody in power seemed to fully absorb that tampering carelessly with the price of bread was one of the most dangerous things a government in this era could possibly do. Turgot himself, apparently sensing the danger, is remembered for once, quietly warning the king with words to the effect of, "Do not interfere with bread." It was advice the French monarchy would spectacularly fail to follow, 14 years later, the exact same danger returned, only this time there would be no putting it back down again. A brutal hailstorm tore through the French countryside in the summer of 1788, shredding crops across huge stretches of farmland just before harvest stones reportedly large enough to kill livestock caught out in the open fields. The winter that followed was one of the coldest on record, cold enough to freeze rivers solid, making it nearly impossible to transport what little grain remained from one region to another. By the summer of 1789, bread prices in Paris had climbed to levels most working families had never experienced in their lifetimes, and in a decision that in hindsight reads almost like dark comedy, the very same revolutionary government that had just finished drafting a bold new Declaration of Human Rights chose only 2 days later to deregulate the grain market all over again. The exact policy that had triggered the flour war a generation earlier. By early October of that year, patience in Paris had simply run out. Bakeries across the city were opening late, running out early, or not opening their doors at all, and the women who did most of the household shopping for their families were the ones standing in those lines longest, absorbing the brunt of every shortage firsthand. On the morning of the 5th, a crowd of market women gathered near the city's bread stalls, furious over both the price and the scarcity of what little was available. Word spread quickly, and within hours thousands of women at the front, many carrying kitchen knives, pikes and whatever else, could pass for a weapon set out on foot toward the royal palace at Versailles 12 miles away in pouring rain. Have you ever wondered what it would take to convince an entire crowd of ordinary working women to march 12 miles through the rain, armed with kitchen tools simply to confront a king? By the time they reached the palace gates that evening, they had one demand above all others: bread, and an audience with the man they mockingly pointedly referred to as the kingdom's baker. The confrontation that followed was tense, occasionally violent and ultimately decisive, with the royal family briefly in genuine danger before order was restored by soldiers loyal to the new revolutionary government. By the following afternoon, King Louis XVI agreed to return to Paris, with the crowd escorted the entire way by a procession of tens of thousands stretching for miles along the road. Wagons of grain rolled alongside the marchers, National Guard soldiers carried loaves of bread raised on their bayonets, and the whole strange, exhausted parade took the better part of a day to complete the journey. Marching alongside the royal carriage, the women sang that they were bringing home the baker, the baker's wife, and the baker's boy, a pointed, almost mocking reference to the king, the queen, and their young son. It was the last time the French monarchy would ever live outside the city, its own hungry citizens called home, and many historians consider that single march, more than any court debate or philosophical pamphlet, the moment the old order in France truly lost its grip for good. Within 4 years, both the king and queen, who'd been marched back to Paris that autumn afternoon, would be executed within sight of crowds who still remembered exactly how that procession had begun, with a demand for nothing more extraordinary than enough bread to survive the winter. Now here is where I want to gently correct one of the most famous myths connected to this exact moment in history, because it deserves a proper, honest look. Nearly everyone has heard the story that when told the peasants had no bread, Queen Marie Antoinette carelessly replied, "Let them eat cake." It is one of the most quoted lines in all of European history, and there is remarkably strong evidence that she never said it at all. The phrase actually traces back to a memoir written by the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, roughly 2 decades before the Revolution even began, describing an unnamed great princess who supposedly made a similarly careless remark. At the exact time Rousseau was writing those words, Marie Antoinette was a child of around 9 years old, still living in Austria, years away from ever setting foot in France. She simply could not have been the woman he was describing, and the word actually used in the original French was not cake at all, but brioche, a rich, buttery bread associated with wealth, which somewhat changes the flavour quite literally of the entire accusation. Whoever first coined the line was not imagining someone offering frosted dessert to starving peasants. They were imagining someone offering an expensive loaf in place of an ordinary one, a subtle but meaningful difference that tends to get lost somewhere in translation and in the centuries of retelling since. The link between this quote and Marie Antoinette does not even appear in writing until decades after her execution, in an 1843 magazine article, long after she was no longer alive to defend herself against it. Some historians believe Rousseau may actually have been echoing an even older version of the same story, one already circulating in French court gossip, about an earlier queen who lived more than a century before Marie Antoinette was even born. Similar tales, in fact, appear scattered across entirely different cultures and centuries. An oblivious noblewoman somewhere in 16th century Germany, reportedly wondering why the starving poor simply did not eat a different kind of sweetbread instead. It appears to be less a specific historical fact, and more a recurring folk tale, the story of the clueless aristocrat retold and reattached to whichever unpopular royal figure happened to be convenient at the time. Letters. Marie Antoinette actually wrote around this period paint a rather different picture than the legend suggests, describing her own sense of obligation toward a suffering population and a recognition that comfortable people like herself owed something in return for how patiently the poor had endured their hardship. None of that nuance, of course, survived nearly as well in popular memory as one sharp, cruel, endlessly quotable sentence she almost certainly never said. So why has this false quote survived so stubbornly for over 2 centuries, while the more complicated, more accurate history quietly faded into footnotes? Perhaps because a single cruel quotable sentence is simply easier for a story to carry than an honest explanation involving weather patterns, deregulated grain markets, and generations of accumulated economic strain. We tend to remember the villain's clever line far more easily than we remember the slow, structural failures that actually built the stage she was standing on. A queen who says something monstrous in 6 words makes for a far tidier villain than a tangled decades-long argument about grain tariffs and harvest yields, even if the tidier version happens to be fiction. If there is a lesson tucked inside all of this, I think it is this one. We like to imagine that revolutions are set in motion by grand ideas, by philosophers debating liberty in candlelit salons, by bold declarations signed with dramatic flourishes. And to be fair, those ideas mattered enormously in France that year. But underneath every one of those lofty debates sat something far more immediate and far less philosophical, an empty bread basket on a kitchen table, and a mother trying to explain to her children why there was nothing in it. Ideas rarely topple a monarchy entirely on their own. Hunger, it turns out, is a far more reliable revolutionary. Have you ever noticed how much easier it is to debate philosophy on a full stomach? It is worth remembering that most of the men writing so eloquently about liberty and natural rights that year were not the ones standing in line outside an empty bakery at dawn, wondering whether there would be anything left to buy by the time they reached the front. That single humble loaf, the very same food that once impressed emperors and decorated the tombs of Egyptian pharaohs, that funded pyramids and filled Roman bellies with borrowed peace, had just quietly toppled one of the most powerful monarchies in the history of the world, not through a philosopher's clever argument, but through the simple, unbearable arithmetic of an empty basket on a kitchen table. But France's troubles with bread were far from unique, and they were far from finished either. Just across the water in England, an entirely different kind of danger was creeping into the very same loaf, one you could not see, could not taste, and would not fully understand until doctors began cutting open the bodies of the very people it had slowly quietly been poisoning for years, one ordinary breakfast at a time. That danger hiding inside an ordinary English loaf was not some rare unfortunate accident. It was for the better part of a century standard business practice, quietly baked into bread sold on nearly every street in the country, and almost nobody buying it had the faintest idea. No riot broke out over this particular betrayal. No crowd marched on a palace demanding it stop. This danger worked far more quietly than that one breakfast table at a time, hidden in plain sight inside the very whiteness people had been taught for generations to associate with quality. Picture an ordinary working household in London sometime in the early 1800s. A mother slicing a fresh loaf for her children before sending them off for the day, believing as any reasonable person would that bread this pale and clean-looking must surely be the better, more wholesome choice compared to the coarser, cheaper loaves sold a few streets over. She had no laboratory, no microscope, and certainly no reason to doubt a baker she had known for years. Nothing about that loaf looked wrong. Nothing about it tasted wrong either, at least not obviously so. And that precisely was the entire problem. There is a bitter irony sitting quietly underneath all of this one worth sitting with for a moment. For centuries, pale white bread had served as a mark of comfort and status, a food good enough for a lord's table, while coarse dark bread stayed firmly associated with poverty and hard labour. In Victorian England, that old hierarchy quietly turned into something closer to a trap. The very whiteness poorer families stretched their budgets to afford, believing they were buying something closer to what the wealthy enjoyed was in many cases the clearest possible sign that a loaf had been tampered with. Chasing the appearance of privilege without ever being told the truth of what that appearance actually cost them, an entire class of people paid extra for bread that was in some real and measurable sense worse for their health than the honest, undisguised loaf sitting cheaper on the very next shelf. Here is the uncomfortable truth about that particular loaf sitting on a Victorian breakfast table. In an era before reliable food regulation, bread was one of the single most commonly tampered with products a family could buy. The reasons were simple and depressingly practical. Fashionable taste demanded bright, pure white bread, but good quality wheat flour, capable of producing that colour naturally, was expensive, and not every harvest cooperated. So bakers reached for a cheap mineral called alum, which whitened dull, low-quality flour and made it behave in ways that disguised its poor condition. Alum did something else useful too, at least from a baker's perspective. It allowed dough to absorb far more water than it normally could without turning gummy or collapsing. And since bread was sold by weight, more water baked into a loaf meant more profit squeezed out of the exact same amount of actual flour. Chalk served a similar whitening purpose. In more extreme cases, records describe plaster of Paris powdered pipe clay and even sawdust worked into dough purely to bulk out the weight of a loaf, sold to an unsuspecting customer. To disguise the sour, unpleasant taste that stale or poor quality flour tends to develop, some bakers stirred in a pinch of ammonium carbonate, masking exactly the kind of smell that might otherwise have tipped off a careful customer standing at the counter. None of this required breaking into a locked laboratory or acquiring some exotic poison. Everything a dishonest baker needed sat within easy reach of an ordinary kitchen supplier, cheap, legal to purchase, and for most of this period entirely unregulated. For years, almost nobody with the power to stop this seemed particularly interested in doing so, until a German-born chemist living in London decided he had seen enough. In 1820, a scientist named Frederick Ackham published a book with one of the most striking covers in the history of food, writing a skull perched above a spider's web framed by intertwined snakes, and beneath it a single grim line borrowed from an ancient religious text, warning simply that there was death in the pot. Inside, Ackham laid out in exacting scientific detail exactly how bread, beer, tea, and dozens of other everyday products were being secretly altered, and in a move that took real personal courage, he named specific shops and tradesmen by name rather than hiding behind the vague general accusations. He wrote with evident frustration that this kind of fraud had grown so widespread across the country that a person could scarcely find a single honest article of food or drink left untouched by it. The book sold out within its first month, was reprinted almost immediately across the ocean in America, and translated into German not long after an unusually wide readership for a dense scientific treatise about flour and chalk. You might expect a story like this to end with Ackham celebrated as a hero, and for a brief moment it looked as though it might. Instead, something far messier happened. The tradesmen he had publicly exposed were furious and powerful enough to fight back. Within a year of publishing his book, Ackham found himself accused of a completely unrelated crime, tearing pages out of library books at a scientific institution in London. Whether the accusation was entirely fair or conveniently timed to silence an inconvenient critic remains debated by historians to this day, but the damage was immediate and total. Facing prosecution and public humiliation, Ackham quietly left England in disgrace, spending the remainder of his career teaching in Germany, his crusade against adulterated food, abandoned along with his adopted home. Have you ever noticed how the person brave enough to say the uncomfortable true thing out loud is sometimes the one who ends up paying for it, rather than the people actually responsible for the problem? For roughly 3 decades afterward, the issue quietly faded from public conversation, even as the underlying practices Ackham had exposed continued largely unchecked. It took a determined physician named Arthur Hill Hassall, working alongside the founder of a prominent medical journal, to finally force the issue back into daylight, this time armed with something Ackham never fully had hard, repeatable visual proof. Beginning in 1851, Hassall spent years examining thousands of food samples under a microscope, methodically documenting exactly what was hiding inside everyday groceries sold across London. His findings, published week after week for the public to see, were staggering. Across the many thousands of samples his team examined, roughly 2 out of every 3 showed clear evidence of adulteration. Bread, milk, tea, sweets, nearly every corner of the British pantry told the same disturbing story once someone finally bothered to look closely enough. Watered-down milk quietly thickened back up with chalk. Tea leaves stretched further with dried reused leaves already brewed once before. Even brightly coloured candy, a treat given freely to children, sometimes owed its cheerful colour to substances no parent would have knowingly allowed anywhere near a child's mouth. The trade itself had even developed its own private slang for these practices, quiet, coded words traders used with one another, so customers standing nearby would have no idea what was actually being discussed. A small telling detail that shows just how deliberate and organised this culture of deception had become, rather than a handful of isolated bad actors cutting corners on their own. Imagine standing at a counter chatting pleasantly with the shopkeeper you trusted, while he and his supplier casually traded a private code word for exactly how much chalk had gone into the loaf you were about to purchase for your children's supper. Would you have caught on, honestly? Most people at the time did not, and there is no particular shame in that. Detecting powdered mineral hidden inside a well-baked crust is not exactly an intuitive skill most of us are born with. The health consequences of alum-laced bread turned out to be far more serious than simple deception over weight and colour. Alum interferes with how the body absorbs certain nutrients from food, and for families whose diet leaned heavily on bread simply because it was the cheapest available calorie, that interference mattered enormously. Some medical researchers of the period, including a physician, better remembered today for tracing a deadly cholera outbreak back to a single contaminated water pump, a discovery that would eventually help found the entire field of modern epidemiology. Also connected adulterated bread to rising cases of a bone disorder in children, their bodies quietly failing to properly absorb what little nutrition that bread should have provided in the first place. It is a strange thing to consider that the same careful scientific mind capable of stopping a cholera epidemic by studying a single water pump also took the time to notice something as unglamorous as chalky bread quietly weakening the bones of poor children across the very same city. The very food meant to keep a poor family alive was in a slow and largely invisible way working against them. Hassel's relentless methodical evidence finally did what Occam's earlier warning alone could not. It forced a formal parliamentary committee to investigate the matter, and eventually it forced Parliament to act. A first law passed in 1860 attempted to address the problem, but without any requirement that local authorities actually enforce it, and it largely failed, with entire districts going months without testing a single sample of food. A stronger version followed in 1872, finally empowering independent public analysts to formally test food samples and hold sellers accountable, though the food trade itself fought bitterly against the new restrictions. And in 1875 a more thorough law arrived, one that finally gave Britain something resembling a modern functioning system of food safety oversight, decades after Occam had first tried and failed to warn an indifferent public. It is worth pausing on something here because I think it quietly overturns an assumption many of us carry without ever examining it. We tend to imagine that food safety regulation is a distinctly modern invention, something that arrived alongside refrigeration plastic packaging and government nutrition labels stamped onto every box in a supermarket aisle. The truth is considerably older and considerably messier. Long before anyone worried about preservatives or food, ordinary Victorian families were quietly being sold chalk plaster and mineral salts, disguised as their daily bread. And it took genuine scientific courage repeated more than once across more than one lifetime before anyone with real power was forced to do something meaningful about it. There is something almost unbearably human about that 30-year gap between Occam's failed warning and Hassel's eventual success. The truth did not change in those 3 decades. Only the willingness of people in power to finally sit with an uncomfortable microscope slide long enough to accept it did. Have you ever noticed how a problem can sit in plain view for an entire generation, obvious to anyone willing to actually look, and still somehow wait for exactly the right person with exactly the right platform before anything changes at all? By the time bread in Britain finally became something closer to trustworthy again, the world it fed was already changing in far more dramatic ways than any single food law could address. The scientists and reformers who had spent decades fighting to purify a simple loaf could hardly have imagined what was coming next. A century where the danger-facing bread would have nothing to do with chalk or alum at all, and everything to do with entire nations at war, fighting not just a territory, but for the grain fields needed to keep their own people fed. Because within a few short decades of that final piece of legislation, an entirely new kind of crisis was about to descend on bread, one measured not in chalk or alum, but in ration cards, empty shelves, and entire nations depending on a single humble loaf to survive years of war. Nations, it turns out, can survive losing a great many things before they finally break. Territory, wealth, even a measure of pride. But take away a population's bread, or even just quietly, steadily shrink it meal by meal, week by week, and something in the collective spirit of an entire country starts to buckle in ways that gold reserves and armies alone can never quite protect against. The 20th century would test that truth twice on two separate continents, in two brutally different ways, and the choices each government made in response would end up telling us almost as much about their national character as any battlefield ever could. Why bread specifically out of every possible food a government might choose to protect or ration first? Because by this point in history, after everything we have already traced together tonight, bread was never simply calories. It was the one food nearly every household, rich or poor, urban or rural, still expected to see on the table every single day without fail. Interrupt the meat supply and people grumble. Interrupt the bread supply and people start to seriously wonder whether their own government still has control of the country at all. Let's start in Germany during the first of those two great wars. From the very first months of the conflict, the British Navy threw a tight, deliberate blockade around German ports, determined to choke off food and vital supplies before a single additional shell ever needed firing. It worked slowly and devastatingly. By the winter of 1916 into 1917, ordinary bread had become something closer to a rumour in many German households. Wheat and rye flour, already scarce, were stretched further and further with substitute ingredients: potato starch, ground beans, even sawdust in some of the more desperate wartime recipes, a grim improvised recipe German civilians came to know simply as war bread. Bakeries that had spent generations perfecting a single trusted recipe were suddenly forced to reinvent that recipe from scratch week after week, based on nothing more than whatever scraps of grain happened to still be available. When the potato harvest failed that same winter, crushed by brutal weather on top of everything else, families were pushed toward eating turnips, a vegetable that until that point had been considered fit, mainly for livestock, boiled mashed, and served in place of nearly everything a normal kitchen once relied on. The period earned its own bitter nickname among the people living through it, the turnip winter, and historians still debate today exactly how much of that suffering came from the blockade itself, and how much came from failures closer to home, disrupted farm labour, requisitioned horses and fertiliser, diverted toward weapons instead of wheat fields. Whatever the precise balance of blame, the result was the same either way. Hundreds of thousands of ordinary civilians facing malnutrition, and in the war's final years, outright starvation, all because the machinery that once reliably turned grain into bread had quietly ground to a halt. The shortages spread well beyond Germany itself, sparking bread riots in Vienna and Budapest, as the wider alliance of Central Powers found their own grain reserves stretched dangerously thin by the very same blockade. Across the ocean in the United States, an entirely different philosophy took hold, one built on persuasion rather than blockade or formal rationing. A businessman named Herbert Hoover, appointed to head a newly created food administration, understood that America itself was in no danger of starving. The actual challenge was feeding an ocean's worth of hungry allies and soldiers overseas without ever imposing strict government controls at home. Rather than issuing ration cards, Hoover's administration leaned almost entirely on public pressure and patriotic messaging designating certain days of the week as wheatless, urging households to bake bread using corn oats, barley, or potato flour instead of pure wheat whenever possible. Newspapers ran cheerful, occasionally quite silly rhymes about wheatless Wednesdays and meatless Tuesdays versus ordinary families memorized and traded almost like a running national joke, and law required that any loaf sold under the patriotic label of victory bread actually contain a meaningful share of these substitute grains not wheat quietly dressed up in a flattering name. Households were urged to remember a simple, catchy piece of advice whenever they found themselves unsure what to cook. When in doubt, eat potatoes, since potatoes were heavy and impractical to ship overseas anyway, making them the perfect food to eat freely at home, while wheat was saved for soldiers and allies across the ocean. Have you ever wondered whether shame and gentle peer pressure could really replace an actual law? In this particular case, it mostly worked. Wheat shipments to Europe and American troops nearly doubled within a year, achieved almost entirely through millions of individual households quietly choosing to eat a little differently, without a single soldier standing guard at a single bakery door. Fast forward 2.5 decades, and Britain found itself facing the very same blockade strategy Germany had endured a generation earlier, only this time from the opposite side of the fight. German submarines prowled the Atlantic shipping lanes Britain depended on for the bulk of its wheat, and in a single month during the spring of 1942, enemy submarines sank well over 200 merchant vessels attempting to cross that ocean. Britain, an island nation feeding roughly 50 million people, imported the overwhelming majority of its wheat from across that same dangerous stretch of water, and government planners calculated that keeping even a modest daily ration of bread flowing to every household required dozens of ships successfully completing that crossing, month after month through waters actively hunting them. Rather than let bread simply run out, or ration it directly and risk public panic, the British government took a different approach entirely. In the spring of that same year, commercial white bread was banned outright, replaced by a single government-mandated loaf made from a denser, less refined flour that used far more of each individual wheat grain husk and all. It became known rather plainly as the national loaf, and the British public, by most accounts, hated it. It was famously grey, famously dense, and prone to turning stale within a single day, with a crumbly, almost sawdust-like texture that some households tried to soften by dipping slices briefly in water before eating. Some sharp-witted citizens, with the kind of dark humour a nation under siege tends to develop, took to calling it Hitler's secret weapon, a joke that managed to be both an insult and, in its own strange way, a badge of shared endurance. Newspaper cartoons of the era poked gentle fun at the whole situation, families grimacing politely over their evening slice, while trying to stay cheerful for the sake of morale. And yet here is the twist worth sitting with for a moment, because it flips almost everything we assumed about bread and class only 2 segments ago in this very story. For centuries, pale, refined white bread had symbolized wealth, comfort and status, while the coarser, darker loaf stayed associated with poverty. Wartime rationing erased that old hierarchy overnight, simply by making the humble, dense, unfashionable loaf the only bread anyone in the entire country was legally permitted to sell or buy. And once nutritionists actually studied its effects, an uncomfortable but fascinating truth emerged. That unpopular grey loaf, packed with far more of the grain's natural fibre, minerals and vitamins than the pretty white bread it replaced, appears to have measurably improved the general health of the British population during some of the hardest years the country had ever faced. Rates of certain nutritional deficiencies actually declined during rationing, not despite the bread shortage, but partly because of the specific bread that shortage forced onto everyone's table, rich and poor alike, for the very first time in the loaf's long history. Government scientists even quietly added calcium directly into the flour itself by law, a deliberate fortification made necessary because the very same whole grain flour that made the bread so nutritious also happened to block the body's ability to absorb calcium properly on its own, a small technical irony tucked inside a much larger one. There is a wonderful small anecdote from this same period that captures the strange equality war can occasionally force into being. When the American First Lady visited Buckingham Palace during the war, touring a country living under years of careful austerity, she later remarked with evident surprise that, although she and the royal family had dined off gold and silver plates that evening, surrounded by all the quiet formality one might expect of a royal dinner, the bread served alongside that grand table was the very same coarse government-issued loaf every other family in the country was required to eat as well. No secret stockpile of soft white rolls hidden away for royal guests. No special exception carved out for the palace kitchen. Kings and commoners for a few unusual years found themselves biting into the exact same slice, a small edible reminder that even the oldest monarchy in Europe was not entirely exempt from the war closing in around everyone else. Perhaps that is the quiet lesson tucked inside this particular chapter of bread's very long history. We tend to assume that scarcity only ever makes life worse, and in the most immediate painful sense, of course, it usually does. And yet forced correctly shared scarcity can occasionally strip away the very inequalities that centuries of gilded feasts and carefully graded loaves had spent so long building up in the first place. Sometimes it takes an entire nation running out of white flour to remember that a queen and a coal miner's wife could after all eat from precisely the same loaf. It is worth asking yourself honestly whether you would have grumbled about that grey loaf too, or whether living through it might have quietly changed your own sense of what a normal breakfast is even supposed to look like. Modern bakeries now charge a small fortune for dense fibre-rich artisan, whole-grain loaves, marketed as a premium health choice, which means, in a strange and slightly funny twist of fate, that plenty of people today are voluntarily paying good money for something remarkably close to what an entire generation of Britons once complained about eating for free. By the middle of the 20th century, bread had survived siege blockade scandal revolution, and rationing emerging from all of it more resilient and more universally shared than almost any other food in human history. But its story was not finished yet, not by a long stretch, because the very same machines and industries that had helped nations survive years of war, the factories, the assembly lines, the relentless drive towards speed and efficiency, were about to turn their full restless attention toward bread itself, promising something that sounded at the time almost too good to be true, a loaf that never needed to be sliced by hand again, and a factory process that could turn a humble grain into millions of identical loaves faster than any baker in human history had ever managed alone. The age of the handmade loaf, the one this whole story began beside a small fire in a quiet desert, was about to meet the machine, and neither bread nor the people eating it would ever look at a simple slice quite the same way again. A jeweller of all people is the one who finally solved a problem that had quietly annoyed cooks for roughly 14,000 years: how to cut a loaf of bread into neat, even slices without a knife, a steady hand, and a fair bit of patience. His name was Otto Roveda, and his story deserves a proper moment here because it is far stranger and far more human than the phrase built from his invention would ever suggest. It is in its own small way the perfect final human story for a food that has spent its entire history being shaped by exactly this kind of stubborn, unglamorous persistence. Roveda sold jewelry for a living in Iowa, but somewhere along the way he became fixated on an idea that most professional bakers around him considered pointless, even faintly ridiculous. Bread, he reasoned, was already baked in tidy uniform loaves. Why should slicing it still depend entirely on a human hand and an ordinary kitchen knife, uneven, unpredictable, and slow? He sold his jewelry stores to fund the project, and by 1917 he had built a working prototype, a heavy 10-foot-long machine studded with a line of thin blades. Then, in a single stroke of terrible luck, a fire tore through the factory housing his machine, and every one of his blueprints, destroying nearly everything he had built. Most people would have called that an ending. Rovedder called it a delay. It took him roughly another decade of rebuilding, testing and rejection, after rejection from bakers who insisted that pre-sliced bread would simply go stale too quickly to ever sell, before he finally found one small-town baker in Missouri willing to take a chance on his strange machine. Neither man got rich from it, and the town itself nearly forgot its own role in the story for decades, until a local journalist stumbled across a faded newspaper clipping and pieced the whole forgotten history back together. On the 7th of July 1928, which happened to be Rovedder's 48th birthday, that baker's shop in Chillicothe, Missouri became the first bakery on earth to sell commercially sliced bread to the public. Shoppers were confused at first. Some bought a loaf purely out of curiosity just to confirm the strange uniform slices inside were actually real. Within 2 weeks, that single small-town bakery saw its sales climb by more than 1,000%. Word spread fast. By 1930, a rapidly growing company launched its own national brand of sliced bread, one that would eventually become a household name across the country. And by 1933, only 5 years after that first curious morning in Missouri, more sliced bread was being sold across America than unsliced. Here is a detail that still makes me smile every time I come across it. During the Second World War, the same government rationing wartime bread and flour in Britain briefly banned pre-sliced bread altogether in the United States too, hoping to conserve the steel used in slicing blades and the wax paper used to wrap the finished loaves. The public reaction was immediate and considerably louder than officials expected. Newspapers ran furious letters from housewives insisting that slicing bread by hand at home wasted more time and arguably more resources than the machines ever had, since loosely wrapped, unevenly cut loaves went stale far faster than the neatly sealed machine-sliced version people had grown used to. Public pressure grew so intense that the ban lasted barely a month and a half before the government quietly reversed course and let the slicing machine start up again. It turns out a population can tolerate a great many wartime sacrifices, but taking away a convenience this small and this beloved apparently crossed a very particular line. That stubborn public reaction is precisely where the now familiar phrase comes from, the greatest thing since sliced bread, a compliment that, however casually we toss it round today, was born from a genuine nationwide refusal to give the invention up. Bread's relationship with machinery did not stop there. Roughly 3 decades later, in a quiet English town whose name would soon attach itself permanently to a very different kind of bread, a team of food scientists set out to solve an entirely different problem. Britain, still recovering from a war that had made every ounce of imported wheat precious, wanted a way to bake good bread using cheaper, lower quality domestically grown grain, the kind that had never produced a satisfying loaf using traditional methods. In 1961, a team of roughly 130 food scientists, funded jointly by the government and several of the country's largest baking companies, perfected a process built around extremely intense mechanical mixing, forcing a dough to develop its structure in minutes, rather than through the many patient hours of slow natural fermentation bread had relied on since the very beginning of this story. The technique, now known simply by the name of the town where it was invented, allowed bakeries to produce a soft, uniform, endlessly repeatable loaf using weaker flour in a small fraction of the time traditional bread required. It worked brilliantly from a purely industrial point of view. Within a decade, this single process was responsible for the overwhelming majority of bread sold in supermarkets across the country, and it remains the dominant method behind most sliced wrapped loaves, sold in Britain even today, feeding millions of households a soft, cheap, endlessly consistent loaf every single week without fail. But something quieter and harder to measure slipped away in the process. All those centuries of slow fermentation had never simply been about patience for its own sake. Long unhurried rising times allow naturally occurring microbes to break down and transform the dough in ways a 5-minute mechanical mixing cycle simply cannot replicate, producing deeper flavour, a more complex aroma. And some researchers now suspect bread that is measurably easier on the human digestive system. Speed had won a clear and decisive victory over flavour, at almost exactly the same moment in history when speed was busy winning nearly every other argument in modern life as well, from fast food to instant communication to same-day delivery. And yet, bread being bread, the story did not simply end with a factory conveyor belt quietly humming forever in the background. Because tucked away on the far western edge of the very same continent, where our story began, a stubbornly old-fashioned tradition had never actually disappeared, waiting patiently for its own unlikely revival. In 1849, French immigrants chasing gold in California opened a small bakery in San Francisco, using a wild yeast starter carried carefully all the way from France, fed and tended daily the entire journey across an ocean and a continent. That original starter, lovingly fed and maintained day after day for generations, survived floods, fires, and most famously the catastrophic earthquake that levelled much of the city in 1906, rescued in the chaos by a baker's wife, who reportedly ran back into a crumbling building specifically to save it, refusing to let decades of careful feeding simply die in the rubble. The wild, local strain of bacteria living inside that starter eventually earned its own scientific name, one that still carries the city's identity built directly into it, a small permanent tribute to a loaf that refused to disappear even when the city around it briefly did. For much of the 20th century, that old, slow, patient style of bread making felt increasingly out of step with a world racing towards speed and convenience. Then, starting in the 1970s, and picking up real momentum through the 80s and 90s, small groups of stubborn, craft-minded bakers, often working out of tiny neighbourhood shops with barely enough space to turn around, began deliberately turning back toward exactly the methods the Chorleywood process had worked so hard to eliminate: long fermentation, minimal ingredients, and the same wild, patient yeast that had first appeared quite by accident in a bowl of forgotten dough thousands of years earlier in Egypt. What started as a smaller, slightly stubborn countercultural movement slowly grew into something far bigger. Artisan bakeries opening in cities across the world, customers willingly lining up before sunrise for a loaf that cost more, took longer to make and tasted by nearly every account, considerably better than anything a factory conveyor belt could produce. And then in the year 2020, something extraordinary happened almost overnight. As an entire world suddenly found itself confined to its own kitchen, during a global pandemic, millions of people who had never baked anything more ambitious than a box of cake mix suddenly found themselves feeding, naming and fussing over their own small jar of bubbling flour and water. Grocery store shelves emptied of flour and yeast within days, sometimes within hours. People gave their starters names, silly affectionate ones, swapped tips online with strangers on the other side of the world, and rediscovered almost by accident the exact same quiet, patient satisfaction that a hunter-gatherer beside a fire in the desert must have felt 14,000 years earlier, watching a simple paste of grain and water slowly transform into something worth sharing. Isn't it remarkable that when the modern world suddenly stopped, so many people instinctively reached backward toward the oldest, slowest version of this exact same food, rather than forward toward anything new at all. Perhaps that tells us something quietly important about what we actually want from bread, and maybe from life more broadly when everything else has been stripped away. Not speed, not convenience, just something honest made slowly with our own two hands that we can share with the people around us. And so here we are at the very end of a story that began beside a small fire in a quiet corner of the desert, long before anyone had a word for farming or civilization or bread itself. We have watched this one humble food travel from ash-covered stones in Jordan to golden fields in Turkey, from Egyptian tombs to Sumerian ration tablets from the Bakers' Guild of Rome, to the trenches of medieval Europe from sacred altars and Passover tables to gilded sugar castles fit for kings. We watched it topple a queen in France, get quietly poisoned by dishonest bakers in Victorian England, and get rations stretched and fought over by entire nations at war. And now, finally full circle, we find it back in the hands of ordinary people, quietly feeding a jar of wild yeast on their own kitchen counter, chasing the exact same simple ancient satisfaction our earliest ancestors once felt beside that very first fire. Bread has fed emperors and toppled monarchies, financed pyramids and started revolutions, been worshipped, weighed, rationed and occasionally poisoned, and through every single one of those changes across 14,000 years, without a single true break, it has never really stopped being what it always was. At the very beginning, water, grain, fire, and a little bit of patience shared between people who needed more than anything else, something warm to hold on to. Thank you so much for spending this time with me tonight, for staying beside me through every fire, every famine, every royal feast, and every quiet kitchen counter along the way. Whatever brought you here tonight, I hope this story gave your mind somewhere gentle to rest before sleep finally takes over. If you found even one small part of this journey as fascinating as I did putting it together, I would love for you to stay close for the next story, because there are so many more quiet corners of history still waiting to be explored together, just like this one. Rest well, sleep deeply, and I will see you again very soon.